Just as I raised my glass to make a toast at my son's wedding, his father-in-law, Harold Hart, pointed straight at me in front of 200 guests and said loudly, "You are not worthy of being part of my family. Your son is nothing but a parasite." The ballroom fell silent, followed by a few awkward, uncomfortable laughs. I froze where I stood, my hand shaking so much that wine spilled down my dress. But while Harold thought I was weak, he had no idea I was holding something that could destroy his entire life, something I had kept in my purse for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And tonight was that moment. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I, Marjorie Lane, 67 years old, believed I had lived long enough not to tremble at anyone's cruelty anymore. But when Harold Hart said those words, under the bright gold lights of the Hilton Hotel ballroom and with 200 eyes fixed on me, my heart tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. My whole life I tried to raise Nathan to be a decent man, respectful, hard-working, building himself from nothing. We were not wealthy, but we were honest. And Harold, with his expensive tuxedo, smug smile, and eyes full of contempt, crushed all of that with a single sentence. I heard silverware stop clinking. A few guests forced awkward smiles to cover their embarrassment. An older woman at the table near mine let out a long sigh, as if witnessing something that should never happen at such a sacred ceremony. But I stayed frozen, feeling only the cold wine seeping into the navy satin dress I was wearing. At that moment, what hurt the most wasn't Harold's words. It was my son's eyes. Nathan stood a few tables away, his face pale, his lips barely moving. "Mom." But before he could come to me, Alyssa, my future daughter-in-law, gripped his hand tightly and shook her head, signaling him to stay silent. His eyes held no anger toward me, only despair. Despair because he was trapped between the two people he loved most and couldn't protect either of us. I looked at Alyssa. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. Clearly, she hadn't expected her father to behave like that, but her fear wasn't strong enough for her to stand up against him. And Nathan, I knew he would stay silent because he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Harold kept talking, his voice steady and sharp like a formal accusation. The Hart family has always been made of accomplished, educated people with solid backgrounds, and I want to say this in front of everyone. I hope my daughter is strong enough to lead a man who is still struggling to find his place in society. Find his place in society, he emphasized each word as if hammering it into my son's dignity. I heard a few small laughs, the nasty approval of people who judge worth by money and reputation. I brushed the wine off my dress and lifted my head to look Harold straight in the eye. I smiled, just a small smile, but enough to make him pause for half a second. Just a flicker, but I caught the discomfort in his eyes. Perhaps he thought I would run off, cry, or ruin the wedding, but I didn't. I just stood there smiling as if I were waiting for him to finish, because I truly was waiting for him to step right into the trap I had laid, not with lies, but with the truth, a truth sharp enough to slice through the armor of reputation he'd worn for years. I tightened my grip on my purse. Inside were envelopes filled with documents, photos, statements, evidence I never wanted to possess, yet had no choice but to keep. Evidence I discovered months ago, starting with a small coincidence that, looking back, I now believe was destiny. Everything began on an April afternoon when I visited Harold and Sharon's home to discuss wedding plans. I arrived earlier than expected, and while I was still near the entrance, I heard Harold's voice coming from his office. His tone was loud, tense, stripped of his usual polished manners. "You need to hide that money. I won't let anyone on the board find out about this. You understand?" I froze, my hand resting lightly on the wooden door frame. I thought I misheard, but then Harold continued, his voice lower but threatening. "And let me be clear. If this gets out, not only will I fall, the entire company will collapse." I stepped back, my heartbeat suddenly fast and uneven. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I knew it wasn't something innocent, and it definitely wasn't something a respectable man like Harold wanted anyone to overhear. When he walked out, I was already in the living room pretending to admire a painting. Harold's face shifted instantly when he saw me. Then he gave me a smile, the same one I'd seen 100 times, overly confident and perfect to the point of being fake. "Oh, Marjorie, you're early," I replied casually, but inside I knew something was wrong. After that day, the uneasy feeling followed me like a shadow. I paid more attention, I observed more closely, and the more I looked, the more the scattered pieces began to fit into something very dangerous. Sharon always dodged questions about her husband's work. Alyssa avoided talking about their family finances, and Harold constantly bragged about Hart and Sons as if it were an impenetrable fortress. But every fortress has cracks. And I, an old mother with nothing but persistence, decided to find them. I went to see Caleb Morton, a private investigator and former cop in Scottsdale. I had hired him 10 years ago for a family matter, and I knew he never did sloppy work. I still remember the look he gave me when I explained the situation. "You want to investigate your future daughter-in-law's father. I want the truth," I said. "That's all I want." Caleb sat quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's begin." I never expected that, just a few weeks. Later, Caleb would return with information that kept me awake for many nights. Nights when I lay in my small home, staring at the ceiling like I was staring into a bottomless void. A void where Harold Hart's reputation, wealth, and entire glittering life were collapsing. And I knew. I would have to unveil that truth at the right moment. Not to get revenge, but to save my son from a life of humiliation. The same humiliation I had just endured under the ballroom lights of his own wedding. Today, tonight, this moment was where it all began. I always thought of myself as easygoing, not picky, with my son's relationships. Nathan was grown, had a stable job, and could choose for himself. But from the moment he brought Alyssa home for dinner, something inside me shifted. Not because I disliked her. Alyssa was beautiful, soft-spoken, and polite, but because her presence changed the air in my home. Something was too perfect, too shiny, too calculated. That evening, Nathan brought Alyssa over. I made pot roast and toasted bread, his childhood favorites. When I opened the door, Alyssa stood there with a bright smile, holding a bouquet of pale pink tulips, wearing a stylish dress and just enough jewelry to draw attention without overdoing it. "Nathan said you love flowers," she said as she handed me the tulips. I accepted them with thanks, but my eyes quickly dropped to her shoes. Expensive designer heels. There's nothing wrong with dressing well, but with Alyssa, everything felt intentional, crafted. Nathan didn't notice at all. He looked at her with bright, excited eyes. The eyes of a man tasting happiness for the first time. I understood. I had once seen that same look in his father, but I also knew that same glow can blind someone to danger. During dinner, Alyssa was sweet, asking about my hobbies, complimenting my kitchen, praising the house decor. but several times when I spoke, she smiled, a polite smile. Yet I had the sense she wasn't really listening. Or maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was too protective of my son. But the feeling grew stronger the night Nathan invited me to dinner at Alyssa's parents' home. The Hart mansion was so large that I felt lost the moment we stepped inside. The front door stood nearly 10 feet tall, the yard perfectly manicured, the floor marble cold beneath my feet. The entryway alone looked like a museum lobby. Harold and Sharon waited at the top of the staircase. Harold in an immaculate suit, grinning wide enough to show every tooth. Sharon in a soft blue dress, smiled gently but avoided my eyes. "Welcome to our home," Harold said, spreading his arms like an MC on stage. Nathan was impressed. Alyssa wrapped her arm around his and smiled, a smile that tightened something in my chest. Dinner was filled with Harold's subtle bragging. He spoke about buying half the mansion in cash, expanding Hart & Sons, his investment portfolio, tax strategies. As if Nathan were sitting through a corporate seminar, Sharon quietly nodded. I listened, silent. At one point, Harold leaned toward me and said, "You know, my family has always protected its reputation. We cannot afford any cracks." He emphasized, "Absolutely cannot." I gave a polite smile, but inside I felt a cold ripple. People terrified of losing reputation usually have something big to hide. Sharon never once met my eyes that night. Alyssa rarely looked comfortable when family finances came up, and the expensive items around the house looked unused, too new. Everything felt like a stage set. As dinner ended, Harold lifted his glass. "My family has protected our name for generations. I hope this marriage does not disappoint us." I heard it loud and clear, a warning, and in that moment I knew the Hart family was not perfect. They only tried to look perfect, and that kind of perfection always hides something. I left that night with a certainty. Something was very wrong, and if I didn't uncover it soon, my son would be the one paying the price. Dinner with both families, the official meeting, was scheduled a few weeks later. Nathan was excited, convinced this was a step toward unity. I didn't want to dampen his joy, so I agreed, though my heart felt heavier with every passing day. The dinner was hosted at an upscale Italian restaurant, the kind Harold described as worthy of discussing the future. Nathan and I arrived first. I wore a beige sweater with an old blazer that had belonged to my late husband. Nathan complimented me, telling me not to worry, but the moment we stepped inside, my heartbeat quickened. Harold and Sharon arrived next, followed by Alyssa in a red dress that drew every eye in the room. Harold shook Nathan's hand, then shook mine with his typical performative smile. "Well, you look better tonight than the last time," he said, as if it were a compliment, but his tone sounded more like a judgment. I smiled politely. Refusing to react was the only way not to turn this dinner into a battlefield. As we sat down, Harold ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu without even glancing at the price. He told us about his busy day, board meetings, a new project inspection, contract negotiations. I noticed the way he talked about his work, as if the entire world revolved around him alone. Nathan sat up straight, trying to look mature and worthy, but I sensed the tension in his eyes. He knew tonight was going to be a test, and Harold was the examiner. He didn't wait long. The appetizers had barely been served when Harold leaned forward, placed both hands on the table, and stared straight at Nathan. "So, Nathan, I want to know your income." No sugar-coating, no warm-up, just a bare, wallet-stripping question. Nathan froze. Alyssa turned to her father and said softly, Dad, not now. Harold raised his hand to silence her. I have the right to know. My daughter is about to marry him. I need to know whether he can provide the life she deserves. We'll build everything together, Nathan said, his voice small but firm. Harold laughed. Build? You're renting a place. Your income barely covers your rent. What kind of life can you give Alyssa? The room seemed to dim a little. I saw my son lower his head, his hands clasped together, just like when he was a child, every time he got a bad grade and was afraid I'd be disappointed. Alyssa sat beside him, staring down at her plate, lips pressed tightly together. She didn't defend Nathan, not one word, not even a gentle squeeze of his hand. My chest burned, not from shame, but from love for my child. I rested my hand lightly on Nathan's, then turned to Harold. I don't think Nathan's job is the most important thing. What matters is that they love each other and respect each other, I said, keeping my voice calm. Harold raised an eyebrow. Respect? May I be honest, Marjorie? You sound a little, idealistic. I smiled just as lightly as he had mocked me. And you sound a little, harsh. Harold let out a laugh, one with no warmth at all. Being harsh means being realistic. Alyssa was raised in a different environment. I don't want her to suffer. I replied, Who said loving Nathan means suffering? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Many people don't realize they're suffering until it's too late. I'm just protecting my daughter. I stayed silent, but inside, everything felt like it was spinning. I was not used to being looked down on by anyone. But what hurt more was watching this man crush my son just to prove he was more powerful. I suddenly remembered what he said at the mansion. My family's reputation cannot afford a single crack. Tonight he was using that reputation to humiliate others, a reputation I was beginning to suspect wasn't real. Nathan tried to salvage the dinner by talking about his job and the projects he was working on, but Harold only nodded indifferently, occasionally hurling sharp questions like tiny needles. Do you plan to buy a house? How much savings do you have? Do you think you have the backbone to protect a family? Nathan answered each question quietly, but I could feel the deep hurt behind every word. Alyssa stayed silent, completely silent. She didn't comfort Nathan, didn't defend him. She looked frozen, or worse, afraid to go against her father. Dinner dragged on awkwardly. I kept my face composed, but my heart broke a little every time I looked at Nathan. When the main course was served, Harold continued, You say you love Alyssa, but love isn't enough, Nathan. Not enough. I set my utensils down. Mr. Hart, I said, my voice so steady even I was surprised. I understand your worry for your daughter. We all worry for our children, but my son is a decent man, and decency is valuable. Harold smirked. Decency doesn't buy a good life. I looked straight into his eyes, but it helps people live a better one. He went silent for a second. Then he let out a half laugh, half sneer. I hope you truly believe that. I didn't respond because at that moment I understood exactly what kind of man Harold was. Someone who stepped on others so he could see himself as taller. He saw Nathan as a temporary choice, as if my son wasn't worthy of climbing the golden staircase he built around his family. When dinner ended, Nathan walked Alyssa to her car. I stayed behind to get my coat. Harold approached me, keeping just enough distance to avoid seeming impolite. I didn't say those things to insult you, he said quietly. I said them as a warning. Your son is not worthy of my daughter. I looked at him for a long time. I wanted to say something sharp, something fierce, but in the end I simply said, "You underestimate people too easily, Harold." He shrugged. "Or you overestimate them." I turned away, but in that moment something cold and determined slid through me. I knew exactly what I needed to do. That night when Nathan drove me home, he spoke very little. I knew he was ashamed, hurt, feeling small under that man's judgment. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, afraid of hurting him more. "You don't need to prove anything to him," I said. "You just need to live true to yourself." Nathan nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully hear me. He hadn't lost to Harold tonight. He had lost to his own fear. When he drove away, I stood on the porch watching the taillights disappear, and I whispered, "You are not walking into a marriage of humiliation. I promise you that." But promises weren't enough. I needed truth. I needed proof of who Harold really was. I needed something Nathan couldn't ignore. From that night on, I wrote down every expression, every comment, every glance Harold made. Every small detail could become a puzzle piece, and the more I recorded, the more cracks I saw in the perfect, wealthy story he had built. What I didn't know yet was that those cracks would lead to a massive secret, one that would tear the Hart family apart on the very day they thought their power was untouchable. In the days after that disastrous dinner, a dull feeling pulsed inside me like a tiny needle pressing into the palm, light but persistent, impossible to ignore. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, not wanting to add pressure, but the image of Harold, his cold eyes, his cutting words, replayed endlessly. A man like that could not be as flawless as the mask he wore. And then, one Friday afternoon, as I parked near the North Scottsdale shopping center to buy baking supplies, I happened to see something I still believe fate placed in front of me. Harold's glossy black SUV was parked in a far corner of the lot, where few cars passed. I recognized the license plate immediately. I'd seen it enough times at the Hart mansion. At first, I thought he was just shopping. But when he stepped out, something was off. He no longer wore his usual smug expression. He kept looking around nervously, as if afraid someone was watching. I leaned slightly in my seat, staying hidden. A minute later, a young woman, maybe in her early 30s, walked toward him. She was naturally beautiful, simply dressed. Beside her were two children, a boy around 8 and a girl around 6. And both children called Harold Dad. I felt my heart drop to the floor of the car. The little girl ran to him, hugging his leg. Harold bent down, stroked her hair with the same hand that had once shaken mine with arrogance. The young woman smiled anxiously and said something quietly. Harold pressed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. They exchanged hushed words, their eyes darting around. Just watching them, I knew they weren't distant relatives. I didn't have experience with other people's family drama, but I had lived long enough to recognize what I was looking at. This was not a coincidence. This was a family. When Harold turned and accidentally spotted me, his face drained of color. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He shoved the children into the SUV, almost too quickly, urged the woman into the front seat, and within seconds the car peeled away, tires almost lifting dust off the pavement. I stood still for a long time, chest tight with anger. How rotten could a man be? How far could someone go with lies just to look respectable? When I finally entered the store, my hands still trembled. That evening, I called Alyssa. I didn't want to confront her. Not yet, but I wanted to hear her reaction. She sounded cheerful at first, but when I casually mentioned Harold and asked what he'd been doing that afternoon, she fell silent. Oh, he must have seen, a cousin. Alyssa said, her voice shaking so noticeably I heard it even through the phone. One of his cousins just came back to town. I closed my eyes. The first lie someone tells when they're cornered is always the worst. I didn't push her. I thanked her and ended the call. But from that moment on, I knew I had stepped into a secret too big for their family to hide behind silence. That night, I opened my late husband's old notebook, the one he used for work, and wrote, day, month, year. Harold Hart has a second family. The next morning, I went to private investigator Caleb Morton's office. Caleb was in his mid-50s, solid build, weathered face, sharp but kind eyes. He had helped me once in a land dispute years ago. He wasn't a man of unnecessary words. When I told him everything, Caleb crossed his arms and listened without interrupting. He only raised his eyebrows when I mentioned the two children calling Harold Dad. I need the truth, I said, fingers entwined, not to destroy Alyssa's life, but to save my son before he gets pulled into a family built on lies. Caleb nodded. I understand. But I want everything to be legal, clear. I want proof, and I want it fast, before the wedding. He opened his notebook and jotted down a few lines. I'll tail him for 2 weeks. His schedule, where he goes, who he meets. If there's something off, you'll know. I exhaled, part of a heavy weight lifting from my chest. Caleb never made empty promises. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 months. I tried to stay normal around Nathan, cooking for him, chatting about his work, and I avoided mentioning Alyssa or the Harts. But when he left the house, I would sit by the window, watching the street, a quiet fire burning in me. Harold remained perfect on social media. Sharon kept posting elegant dinners. Alyssa kept smiling every time Nathan brought her to visit. But now, I saw the truth behind the pictures. Some secrets are so big that people must perform a lifelong play to hide them. On day 12, Caleb called. Mrs. Lane, he said, his voice low, I think you should come to the office. I knew that tone. It wasn't good news. When I arrived, Caleb placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were photos of Harold with the woman I had seen, and with the 2 children, photos of them at the park, eating dinner, walking the kids to school. Not acquaintances, a real family. Caleb flipped to another page. Bank transfers, purchases, tuition payments, all funded from an account tied to Hart & Sons. He's had a second family for 8 years, Caleb said, and he's supporting them entirely with company money. My breath hitched. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Caleb continued. There are unexplained withdrawals from several construction projects. I can't confirm the full legal implications yet, but... He pushed the financial report toward me. The gaps are huge. I opened each page, my hands trembling slightly. The numbers, the shady line items, the strange notes. They all came together into one clear picture. Harold wasn't just deceiving his wife and children. He was deceiving the company, the shareholders, and everyone who believed he was an honest businessman. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the small office spin around me. Are you all right? Caleb asked. I took a deep breath. I'm all right. I was prepared for this. It just still hurts a little. Caleb nodded. I closed the file. Looking at it on the table felt like staring at a fire ant nest. Touch it once, and the whole swarm would come pouring out and tear everything apart. I knew from that moment on, I had stepped into a battle far bigger than anything I ever imagined. But I also knew something else, more clearly than ever. I would not let my son walk into a marriage tied to a family built on lies. Caleb's file sat in front of me the entire evening like a stone pressing against my chest. I read every page, every number, every little scribble he had marked in red. Each line was a blade slicing into the perfect image Harold always tried to present, the same image my son was preparing to step into with blind trust. I had thought Harold having a second family was the lowest form of betrayal. But when Caleb expanded his investigation, I realized I had only seen the tip of a massive iceberg. The next morning, I went back to Caleb's office. As soon as he saw me, he stood, opened a drawer, and took out another thicker stack of documents. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice low and heavy, "I'm afraid things are even worse than we expected." I tightened my grip on my purse, my heart pounding. How bad? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He handed me a financial statement covered in numbers. Hart & Sons has hidden debts in the tens of millions of dollars. I almost couldn't believe my ears. But Harold said his company was growing. "That's exactly the problem," Caleb cut in. "He lied, or more precisely, he's been surviving on layers of forged documents, fake contracts, and highly sophisticated financial manipulation." My legs lost strength as I sank into the chair. Caleb opened page after page. Project accounts drained with no explanation. Funds transferred to a shell company under the young woman's name. The remaining money funneled into high-risk investments to make up the losses, which failed miserably. "Where did he get the money?" I asked, though the answer was already crystal clear. Caleb looked at me with sad eyes. "From the low-income housing project, a large portion was siphoned off to support the second family." I inhaled sharply, not from shock, but from pure outrage. I wasn't someone who cried easily, but knowing poor families lost their homes because Harold wanted to live two lives, it hurt in a different way. "What did he do to the project?" I asked. Caleb placed a set of photos in front of me. Unfinished buildings, cracked brick walls, incomplete roofs, pipes propped up temporarily. "They reported 100 completed units," Caleb said. "In reality, they've built fewer than 40, and the quality is terrible." My hands trembled as I turned to the next page. "Fake documents," Caleb continued. "Inflated material costs, contractor swaps for kickbacks. Some workers haven't been paid for months. I met 3 of them. All said Harold threatened to sue them if they spoke up." I leaned back, holding my head with both hands. Each detail was a hammer blow, heavier than the last. "Has anyone tried to sue?" I asked. "Yes," Caleb replied, "but they were intimidated. Harold has cousins in major banks and friends on the city council. He knows exactly who to use to keep mouths shut." I stayed silent. A man with 2 families was bad enough, but a man who stole millions of dollars from housing for the poor, withheld wages from workers, and threatened victims, that was beyond betrayal. That was a crime. Caleb placed one hand gently on the table. "I know what you're thinking." I looked up. "Do you?" He nodded. "You're wondering if you should expose him. You're thinking about Nathan and Alyssa, too." I bit my lip. "Alyssa doesn't know about this, does she?" "I don't believe she knows everything. Maybe a little, but certainly not the full scale." I closed my eyes. Alyssa's face flashed in my mind. The way she sat silent while Nathan was humiliated at dinner, the shaky lie about cousins, her inability to stand up to Harold even once. I didn't hate Alyssa, but I wasn't naive enough to believe she was strong enough to survive the storm that would follow. If this exploded, she would be the first to be swept away. Caleb said, "You should understand, if you bring him down, it won't just be a scandal. It'll blow up across the entire city." I opened my eyes. I don't want revenge, Caleb. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to save my son before he ties his life to a family built on lies. If they marry, Nathan will sink with him. Caleb studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then what you need is timing. I asked softly, what timing? The moment when the truth destroys him the most? The moment when the whole world is watching him? I understood immediately. The wedding. The day Harold Hart wanted to flaunt his reputation, his family, his power. The day he believed everything was his. Respect, admiration, control. If the truth came out on that day, it wouldn't just crack his mask. He would destroy himself in front of everyone he sought to impress. I stood, thanked Caleb, and held the file to my chest like a ticking bomb. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in the old chair by the window, the one my husband used to sit in when he read the newspaper, and watched the streetlights reflect on the grass outside. The cool Arizona night air slipped through the window crack, but I still felt warm. I thought about Nathan, about how he lowered his head before Harold at dinner, about how he wanted to be stronger so he could deserve Alyssa, about the future he was chasing, a future he didn't know was built on deception. I touched the edge of the file. So many numbers, so much evidence, so many voices, enough to destroy Harold and save my son. But I also knew, once I took this step, there would be no turning back. The next day, when Nathan stopped by to grab his suit for a fitting, he wore a smile I hadn't seen since the dinner with the in-laws. "Mom, things are getting better," he said. "Harold, well, Alyssa's dad, seems to be trying to accept me." I looked into his eyes, those hopeful eyes too pure to see what I had seen. "Nathan," I asked softly, "are you truly happy?" He smiled. "I have Alyssa. That's enough." I didn't say another word. I couldn't. If I spoke, I would have had to tell him everything, and the time for that hadn't come. When he drove away, I pressed a hand to my chest and whispered, "My son, I will protect you, even if it means shattering that man's perfect facade." I looked at the file one last time before closing it. That night, I understood one thing clearly. If I wanted to save Nathan, I had to let Harold collapse under the weight of his own secrets. And the wedding would be the place where he would bow before the truth. After that tense dinner with the in-laws, I could feel Nathan slowly drifting away from me. Not because he wanted to, but because something thin and fog-like had formed between us, something Alyssa had woven so softly that Nathan couldn't feel it, but I could see it clearly. Nathan still visited me every week, but instead of stepping inside with his usual warm smile, he now lingered at the doorway, as if weighing something before speaking. His words began to change, sharper, more sensitive, and sometimes hurtful in a way I never imagined he could be. One afternoon, when he came by to pick up a jacket I had washed, his face looked more strained than usual. I invited him in, but he stood in the middle of the living room, hands in his pockets, staring at the carpet as if the words he carried were too heavy. "Mom," he began, quiet but firm, "Alyssa said, 'You're not happy about her family.'" I set my teacup down. I had braced myself for this conversation, but when it actually arrived, my chest tightened. "Son," I said gently, "I just want you to be happy." Nathan sighed, then lifted his eyes to mine. "Alyssa said you're jealous." My heart sank, not because of the accusation, but because Nathan believed it enough to repeat it. "Jealous of what?" I asked calmly. "Jealous that her family is wealthier, that they have more." He paused, then added, "Alyssa said you don't like her because she comes from a better background." I let out a faint laugh, not of amusement, but of disbelief that such an idea could exist. "Nathan," I said, "I've lived long enough to know what's worth envying and what isn't. A wealthy family isn't on my list." But Nathan shook his head, as if my words couldn't reach him. "Then why do you always get upset when Harold is mentioned?" he asked. I wanted to say, "Because Harold is a liar, a betrayer, and a dangerous man." I wanted to open the safe, pull out every document and photo Caleb had collected, but I couldn't. Not then. Not before the right moment. "Because I'm afraid someone will hurt you," I said instead. Nathan looked at me. For a brief second, tenderness flickered in his eyes, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by the unfamiliar coldness I had been seeing lately. "Alyssa said you don't respect her dad," he continued. "She said you look down on his success." I stayed silent. "And isn't that true?" Nathan's voice trembled slightly. Maybe he didn't want to say it, but he did. I didn't feel angry, just deeply hurt, the kind of hurt that sinks through bone. When your child begins to see you through someone else's eyes, you finally understand what it means to lose a child without anyone stealing them from you. I stood, placed my hand on Nathan's shoulder. "Son," I said slowly, "I don't look down on anyone, but I have eyes. I see things you don't yet see. I just want you to think carefully about this marriage." He gently brushed my hand off his shoulder instinctively. "Mom, can't you just accept Alyssa?" I swallowed the ache in my throat. "I can accept anyone who makes you happy," I said, "as long as they treat you well, as long as their family doesn't make you feel small." Nathan frowned. "That's your view, Mom, not mine." I didn't respond, because I knew the more I spoke, the more he would think I was against Alyssa. And that was the last thing I wanted before the truth came out. When Nathan left, I stood by the window and watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street. I placed a hand over my heart, feeling it race with fear. Fear of losing him. Fear that the truth would come too late. Fear that he saw me as controlling or selfish. Fear that he would marry into an illusion and one day pay for it with his whole life. Sometimes motherhood isn't pulling your child into your arms. It's watching them walk toward a mistake and waiting for the exact moment to pull them back before they fall off a cliff. That night, I went into my bedroom, opened the closet, and took out the small safe I kept under the spare blanket. I placed it on the bed and slowly unlocked it. Inside were the 3 brown envelopes I had been preparing for days. One envelope had Nathan's name on it. One envelope had Alyssa's name. One envelope had Sharon Hart's. Each envelope was thick with papers, photos, financial records, and construction reports Caleb had quietly collected. I had printed every document, labeled each page clearly. Everything inside was the truth. The truth Harold had been hiding behind layers of power and money. I touched the envelope with my son's name a little longer. Inside, it was everything he needed to know so he wouldn't be buried under the rubble Harold was building with his dirty hands. I wanted to tell him right away, but I knew if I gave him this envelope too early, he would think I was trying to ruin the wedding. If I gave it too late, his life could be crushed. The right timing. That was what Caleb reminded me. The right timing. That was what I repeated to myself every day. A few days later, Alyssa texted me, "I hope you understand I never meant to make Nathan drift away from you." I stared at that sentence and felt my heart turn cold, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. Alyssa didn't want a war, but she wanted Nathan to belong to her family, entirely, without ties, and Harold wanted that too. That was when I understood the real meaning of the fear of losing a child. It's not someone ripping your child from your arms. It's when they make your child believe another embrace is softer, safer. I folded my phone shut and breathed deeply. I couldn't blame Alyssa completely. She grew up in a world where family prestige mattered more than truth. Love was often defined by how well you obeyed. And Harold, he had taught her that. And Nathan? He loved. He was blind. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to be a good man in Alyssa's eyes. But to do that, he was unknowingly drifting further and further away from me. I reminded myself, wait, Marjorie, wait for the right moment. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I opened the safe again. I took out the 3 envelopes and checked them one last time. Photos of Harold holding the 2 children. Video of Harold transferring money into the shell company account. Fake financial reports. The list of underpaid workers. Photos of the unfinished low-income units that were reported as completed. I organized everything neatly and put it back into the safe. I knew. One day soon, Harold would have to face all of this in front of his own family, and no one would be able to save him from the truth. I closed the safe, pushed it deep under the closet shelf, and covered it with a blanket. I turned off the light and walked into the living room, where the glow from the street lamp stretched my shadow across the floor. I looked at that shadow and whispered, "The wedding won't be peaceful, Harold Hart, and I'll be there. I won't let my son be buried under your fake reputation." I sat down on the chair, stretched my arms, and exhaled slowly. Outside, the night wind rustled through the old oak trees in the yard. It was a quiet evening, but inside me, a storm waited for its hour to rise. I prepared myself for everything, for the collapse, for the tears, for the anger, for the panic, for even the bitter laugh Harold wouldn't be able to force out once his mask fell. I wasn't seeking victory. I wasn't seeking revenge. I only wanted one thing, to save my son, before it was too late. Nathan visited me on the afternoon before the wedding. I had just put a batch of pastries in the oven when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was my son's smile, a smile so wide it felt like it lit up the hallway. Nathan wore a white shirt, khaki pants, his hair neatly trimmed, and his eyes glowing with a pure happiness I hadn't seen in a long time. "Mom," Nathan said, opening his arms and hugging me, "tomorrow will be the best day of my life." I hugged him back, but my hands trembled. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "I'm happy for you, Nathan." But my heart felt squeezed tight, because I knew what Nathan didn't. I knew the truth, the kind of truth that would break him if he learned it tonight. Nathan walked into the kitchen, sat down, and took a deep breath as if he needed courage to say something. "Mom," he said, "I want you to really be happy for me. I want tomorrow to be perfect." I opened the oven and set the tray of pastries on the counter to cool. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled the kitchen. The scent of his childhood, of Christmas mornings, of school days when I woke early to bake for him. "I always want you to be whole," I said. "But son, marriage isn't just love. It's family, and you should think carefully about the family you're walking into." I didn't say it to ruin his wedding. I said it because I was his mother. I said it because my heart hurt too much not to. Nathan leaned back in his chair, hands rubbing his temples. "Mom, you're starting again," he muttered, "again with the Hart family." I turned around and looked right into his eyes. The eyes I once wiped tears from, the eyes I watched grow up, the eyes that lit up when he achieved his first dream. "I'm not starting anything," I said softly. "I'm worried." Nathan shook his head, giving a small, strained smile. Not the warm one he arrived with. "What is there to worry about, Mom? I love Alyssa. She loves me. Her family might be a little strict, but that doesn't matter." I asked the question I had carried in my heart for months. "Are you sure they see you as part of their family?" Nathan looked up, his expression briefly annoyed. "You're prejudiced against them." I stood still. I didn't want to argue, not tonight. But that sentence pierced me, not because it was harsh, but because it carried the tone of Harold, and that frightened me more than any of the financial evidence Caleb had uncovered. I walked closer and placed a hand on my son's shoulder. "Nathan," I said slowly, "I'm not prejudiced. I have experience. I have eyes, and I see what you don't yet see." He looked away. When he looked back, there was a layer of defensiveness in his gaze I had never seen before. "You don't know them the way I do," he said. "I spend more time with them than you. They're not as bad as you think. You're just worrying too much." I didn't argue. I didn't say Harold was a liar. I didn't say Heart and Sons was drowning in debt. I didn't say Alyssa was being manipulated by her own father. I didn't say anything I knew, because if I did, tonight would destroy Nathan, not Harold. I simply looked at my son for a long time, so long that he lowered his head slightly, as if he could feel the sadness in my eyes. "Mom," he whispered, I love you, but I also have to live my own life." I nodded. "And I want you to live that life in real happiness, not inside a glossy wrapper someone else created." He sighed again, a long sigh that felt like every cell in his body was being stretched thin. "Tomorrow, just come, okay?" he said. "I want you there." I placed my hand on his cheek. "No matter what happens, I'll always be there. Always." Nathan smiled, a smile that made my heart ache and warm at the same time. Then he left, saying he needed to go help Alyssa with the rehearsal. When the door closed, the house fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes your chest shake. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, both hands over my heart, trying to breathe. Tonight, I knew I wouldn't sleep. When the streetlights flicked on, I opened the safe again. The 3 envelopes lay there. 3 truths that would change the fate of the entire Hart family. I placed them on the dining table, turned on the lamp, and began checking each envelope. In Nathan's envelope, photos of Harold holding the 2 children, bank statements showing he funded them with company money, video of him meeting the young woman in the parking lot, reports of the unfinished housing project. In Alyssa's envelope, the truth about the father she idolized, written more gently, with a note telling her she wasn't at fault, but she needed to know who she was defending. In Sharon's envelope, financial documents, proof Harold created a private fund under another woman's name, statements showing he withdrew money from their joint account. I added a few small notes to each file. Short explanations, easy to understand, so no one could misinterpret anything. I made sure everything was clear, organized, and factual. By the time I finished, the clock struck 11 at night. The lamp cast a warm glow on the pages, making them look almost golden, not because of the light, but because of the weight of the truth inside them. I remembered Caleb's words. To make him expose himself, you need a big stage. And tomorrow, I would have a ballroom of 200 people. Tomorrow, Harold would think he was at the peak of his reputation. Tomorrow, The entire city would be watching the Hart family, and tomorrow the mask he had worn for years would fall. I gathered the envelopes and placed them carefully into my purse. I touched the purse, thinking about how it now carried the fate of so many people, Nathan, Alyssa, and even Sharon. I turned off the lamp, letting the kitchen sink into the gentle darkness of the Arizona night. When I stepped into the living room, I paused at the window, looking at the sky sprinkled with tiny stars. I whispered, almost to myself, "Tomorrow, son, I'll protect you, and no one will stop me." I stood there a little longer, letting my fear and determination blend together. Tomorrow was the wedding, but for me, tomorrow would be a battle. The wedding took place under the bright golden Arizona sun, the kind of sunlight people get used to here, but today it felt harsher than ever. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed time to breathe and steady myself before facing a family teetering on the edge of a cliff they didn't know they were standing on. The hotel ballroom was decorated beautifully. Crisp white tablecloths, flickering candles, rows of pure white lilies lining the tables. Everything was perfect. Perfect in the exact way Harold always imagined. I sat at my assigned seat at the third table, not too far from the stage, but not close enough to be the center of anything. Nathan appeared soon after, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a navy tie I had given him months ago. His face glowed with excitement, though a hint of nerves lingered. When our eyes met, he smiled. That gentle, honest smile I adored. Good, I thought. My son deserves happiness, but not the kind built on lies. The ceremony passed gently, warmly, almost making me forget everything I had prepared. But that moment didn't last. After Nathan and Alyssa exchanged vows, the wedding music soared through the applause. I tried to stay calm, but my hand quietly gripped the edge of the table. Then came the toasts, the part Harold had rehearsed as if it were a performance. He stepped onto the stage amid applause, his tuxedo sharp, his smile practiced, his eyes full of arrogance. He swirled a champagne glass and looked over the ballroom with triumph. "Many of you here know," Harold began, "that the Hart family has always maintained high standards of honor and class." My heart sank. His voice dripped with poison. "And today," he continued, "I am proud that my daughter is entering a marriage we have carefully considered." I saw Nathan stiffen. Alyssa glanced at her father, confused, but Harold kept going, his tone as sharp as a blade. "To be honest," Harold said, lifting his glass and locking eyes with me as if issuing a challenge, "our family has standards, and Nathan, my new son-in-law, may not fully meet those standards yet." The ballroom fell silent. A few people gave polite, awkward laughs. My hand trembled once again. "Nathan," he said, "you're a good young man. I acknowledge that. But my daughter marrying you is a downgrade." I heard several people around me gasp sharply. Shannon, the bridesmaid, brought her hand to her mouth. Nathan looked as if someone had slapped him across the face. His expression drained and his lips trembled. I saw his shoulders pull inward, like a child being scolded in front of a classroom. Alyssa turned toward her father, ready to protest, but Harold raised his hand as if forbidding her to say a single word. I felt the blood rush to my face, not because he insulted me, I was used to that, but because he humiliated my son on the most important day of his life. And I knew the time had come. I stood up. No one had time to react. I walked quickly toward the stage, the sound of my heels crisp against the wooden floor, each step pushing me closer to a moment I could never undo. Harold saw me and widened his eyes. "What are you doing?" I yanked the microphone from his hand as the room fell into stunned silence. A few whispers rose. Some people stood halfway from their chairs as if anticipating a scene no one dared imagine. I took a deep breath, and I began. "I'm sorry for interrupting," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding like a drum. "But if Mr. Hart has spoken honestly, then I believe it's time for me to do the same." Harold moved toward me to snatch the microphone back, but the sound technician had already muted his mic. That set him off. He barked, "Turn her mic off! Turn it off!" But no one moved, maybe because they didn't understand what was happening. Or maybe they wanted to see. I reached down to the small handbag sitting on the floor near the stage. I opened it and pulled out the thickest envelope, still sealed with my mark. "I have something here," I said. "A wedding gift for everyone, especially for my son, my future daughter-in-law, and Mrs. Sharon Hart." That name made Sharon lift her head. Even from a distance, I saw her go pale, as though she sensed disaster approaching. I opened the envelope. Inside were the photos Caleb had taken. I held one up toward the projector. "This," I said clearly, "is Harold Hart and his second family." The room erupted with noise. I pressed the remote the technician had slipped into my hand earlier, proof they had been prepared for this moment. The giant screen behind the stage lit up. Photo 1. Harold hugging a little girl with curly hair kissing her forehead. Photo 2. Him standing beside the young woman, his arm wrapped around her waist. Photo 3. The two children clutching his legs, mouths open as they called him Dad. A piercing scream broke out. It was Sharon. She collapsed onto her chair, hands trembling violently, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Alyssa burst into tears, stumbling backward as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Nathan stood frozen, his gaze torn apart between pain and disbelief. Harold lunged toward the projector, his face blazing red, shouting, "Stop! Turn it off! Are you all insane?" But the technicians, two young men who had likely endured Harold's barking during the rehearsal, didn't move. One exhaled and whispered, "Sorry, Mr. Hart. This is a valid request." Harold roared, "Valid! This is my daughter's wedding. You—" I continued, my voice steady and strong. "And here are the withdrawal records." The receipts appeared on the screen. Detailed transfers, the shell company account, secret payments for Family M, the young woman's name. Then, the video of Harold meeting the woman in the parking lot, him bending down to lift the child, him glancing around nervously, him kissing the child's hair. The ballroom froze. No one laughed. No one breathed loudly. Everyone simply stared at Harold, at the truth, at the falling mask. Harold spiraled into panic. He rushed at me and ripped the microphone from my hand, but instead of speaking, he only opened his mouth silently. His lips trembled, his eyes bulged, his hair was disheveled, and his breathing came in ragged bursts. I could see the chaos inside him, the chaos of a man who knew he had been cornered. Harold stammered. I'm being framed. This is slander. But no one spoke in his defense. No one believed him. No one took his side. Alyssa sobbed and ran toward Nathan, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a whirlpool. Nathan, still shattered, held her out of instinct. Sharon collapsed onto the floor, her trembling hands gripping the table. A few people rushed to lift her, but her head kept shaking as if she couldn't accept the reality. The ballroom descended into chaos. Some people screamed. Some recorded on their phones. Some sprinted for the exits. Some stood frozen like stone statues. The clatter of falling glasses, scraping chairs, hurried footsteps, and sobs blended into a storm of sound, unlike anything I had heard at a celebration. But through it all, I stood still. Not because I was calm, but because I had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. The moment truth sliced through Harold Hart's golden mask. The moment he couldn't hide behind money, power, or his voice. The moment everyone in the ballroom saw him exactly as he was. A liar, a hypocrite, and a cruel man. And finally, the moment I could look my son in the eye and say, "Do you see now, Nathan? This is the truth I wanted you to know." Harold left the stage like a man whose world had collapsed beneath him. He stumbled between tables, stepping on tablecloths and knocking over a flower vase nearly 3 feet tall. His shouts blended with Alyssa's cries, Sharon's frantic calls, and the murmurs of stunned guests, forming a chaos beyond description. I watched Harold burst through the ballroom doors. 2 security guards tried to stop him, but he shoved them aside and disappeared. Seconds later, I heard camera shutters clicking. Reporters were already waiting in the hallway, as if Harold's downfall had been destined. I stood on the stage, holding the muted microphone. I didn't regret anything, but my heart felt heavy, like a stone sat on it. Not because of Harold, but because of Nathan. When I turned around, I saw my son standing in the middle of the ballroom like a man lost in a blizzard. His face was drained, his lips trembled, and his eyes looked as if something he believed in for months had just died. "Mom." Nathan stepped toward me, his voice trembling. "Why did you do this? Why did you ruin my life?" It felt like someone had sucked the air out of my lungs. Some words, even without malice, cut like knives. This was one of them. I didn't answer immediately. I gently touched his hand, but he pulled away, a reflex that shattered my heart. "Nathan," I whispered, "I didn't ruin your life. I saved it." "That's a lie," Nathan shouted, a cry filled more with despair than anger. "You humiliated my family. You exposed everything in front of everyone. I can't bear this." "You can't bear it because you don't know everything yet." I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope with Nathan's name. "Read it. Read all of it before you blame me." Nathan stood frozen, hesitant to take it, but Alyssa, her face soaked with tears, stepped closer and touched his arm. "Nathan, you should read it." Her voice was so shaky it was almost a whisper. I looked at her. For the first time, her eyes held no trace of the overconfidence typical of the Hart family, only fear, loss, and realization. Nathan took the envelope with trembling hands. He opened it and pulled out the pages. I watched his eyes shift from surprise to confusion to complete collapse. "Why?" His voice was so faint I had to lean in to hear. "Why did he use my name to withdraw the money?" I swallowed the bitter knot in my throat. Harold, eager to build the image of the wonderful father, had made Nathan sign a series of symbolic forms, which Nathan believed were nothing more than routine paperwork. But in Caleb's files, those signatures had been used by Harold to legitimize several suspicious expenses. "Nathan," I said as gently as possible, "he didn't ask for your signature because he trusted you. He needed you as cover." Nathan dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. Alyssa knelt beside him. I didn't know anything. If I had known... I placed my hand on her shoulder, something I never imagined myself doing a few weeks ago. "You're a victim too, Alyssa," she cried harder. Meanwhile, Sharon was carried out of the room. but she hadn't lost consciousness. Her eyes remained open, watching me through her tears. When I approached, she reached out and gripped my hand. "Thank you," Sharon whispered. "Thank you for saving my children and me." Her voice was barely there, but the gratitude in it was heavy. I squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing, because no words could ease what she was going through. Reporters flooded into the ballroom. Headlines flashed on guests' phone screens. "Powerful businessman Harold Hart flees daughter's wedding." Leaked photos. Does Hart have a second family? Financial misconduct suspected at Hart & Sons. And I knew, in less than 24 hours, the entire city of Scottsdale would be talking about this. In less than 48 hours, all of Arizona would know. And in less than 72 hours, the Hart family would fall. Nathan stayed seated, silent like the shadow of himself. I sat beside him, not touching him, just close enough so he knew I was there. "Nathan," I said, "I know this is unbearable, but you must understand, I didn't do this to beat anyone. I did this so you wouldn't get pulled into Harold's crimes." "He used me," Nathan said, his voice cracked. "He wanted me to be his shield." I nodded. "Because you're the only decent person in that family." Nathan broke down crying, the quiet, painful cry of a grown man whose heart had cracked open. I pulled my son into my arms, letting him cry the way he once did when he fell off his bike in the front yard. "I have nothing left," he whispered. "That's not true." I held his face in my hands. "You have me, and you have the truth." Alyssa stood, wiping her tears. Her face was pale, but there was a new clarity in her eyes, the kind that only deep pain can create. "Mrs. Lane," she said, "I'm sorry. I thought you hated me. But now I understand you were trying to protect Nathan." I placed my hand on Alyssa's shoulder. "You were never the problem. The fault lies with the man who taught you how to see the world." Alyssa lowered her head. "I don't know what tomorrow will be like, but I do know this. Thank you for showing me the truth before it was too late." That night, the police went to Harold's house. They didn't arrest him, not yet, but they seized several documents. I knew because Caleb messaged me a little after 11 p.m. "The evidence you provided has reached the right people. The formal investigation has begun." The next morning, the news published. Harold Hart under investigation for financial fraud, embezzlement, forged records, and misuse of social project funds. By noon, 3 investors of Hart & Sons filed lawsuits. By late afternoon, a group of workers gathered in front of the company demanding their wages. And by the morning of the 3rd day, exactly 72 hours after the ruined wedding, the Hart & Sons headquarters building was officially sealed for investigation. The Hart family, once a symbol of Scottsdale's elite, became the center of the biggest scandal of the decade. Someone called me and asked if I felt satisfied. I simply answered, "No, I just feel relieved because the truth finally has its proper name." Nathan stayed at my house for 3 days straight, spending most of the time quietly lying in his room, holding on to his new reality. But each day he came out with less redness in his eyes and less trembling in his shoulders. Alyssa texted. Sharon sent her thanks. Many guests from the wedding called to apologize for laughing along with Harold, but to me, none of that mattered. The most important thing was that my son had escaped a path that would have dragged him into a bottomless pit. And I had kept my promise, a promise only a mother could fully understand. I will save you, even if I have to stand against the whole world. 3 days after the storm named Harold Hart, Nathan shut the door to the room in my house and only came out when he needed water. I didn't knock, didn't push, didn't question him. I had been a mother for more than 40 years, and I knew some pain must break on its own and mend on its own. No one else can touch it. But on the morning of the 4th day, while I was slicing apples in the kitchen, I heard hurried footsteps. I turned around and Nathan ran in and hugged me tightly, so tightly that I had to set the knife down and steady myself by holding his shoulders. "Mom?" His voice cracked right into my chest. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." I felt his whole body tremble, not from cold, but because he had finally let all his defenses fall. I placed my hand on his cheek, stroking it the way I used to when he was little, then pulled him into my arms. "You don't need to apologize," I whispered. "You just need to come back to yourself." Nathan stepped back slightly and wiped his tears with his sleeve. His eyes, for the first time in days, held a bit of light again. "I got swept up in their glamour, Mom. I kept thinking, that was the dream. That was the success I wanted to build." He paused for a moment, then sighed, as if he had just confessed the hardest truth. "But really, I felt like they were trying to reshape me to fit into their mold." I held his hand tightly. "You weren't wrong for loving. You were only wrong if you thought you had to lose yourself to be loved." Nathan bowed his head and slowly nodded. The next day, I received a message from Alyssa. Not long, not dramatic. "Mrs. Lane, if you don't mind, I'd like to meet you this afternoon." I agreed. We met at a small cafe on a corner of Camelback Road, where sunlight streamed through the windows, laying warm golden strips across the wooden tables. Alyssa arrived in a beige knit coat, her hair tied neatly, her face pale but without the arrogance she once carried. She sat across from me, her fingers intertwined, her gaze lowered as if she didn't yet have the courage to look at me directly. "How is your mother?" I asked. "My mom is still shocked," Alyssa answered, "but she's stronger than I thought. She said, 'Maybe this is the best thing that's ever happened to me.'" I gave a small smile. Sharon, the woman who had always bowed under Harold's shadow, had finally stepped out of the invisible cage he built around her. Alyssa continued, "I'm sorry for ever thinking you disliked me. I didn't understand anything. I thought you just judged my family for not being good enough for Nathan." "Alyssa," I placed my hand over hers, "you were never the one I disliked. What I disliked was the lying." Alyssa nodded slightly, her eyes reddening. "I'm looking for a job now, any job. I don't want to live off my dad's money anymore, and I know things will be hard." "Hard is the right path," I said, "but you won't walk it alone." She looked up at me, startled. "Why would you help me after everything?" I smiled, the smile of a mother who has lived long enough to understand people. "Because you were deceived too. Because you also lost something. And most importantly, because you love Nathan, not the heart name." Alyssa lowered her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. That evening, I told Nathan, not to pressure him into any decision with Alyssa, but so he could understand that truth always has more sides than the pain he was carrying. Nathan sat on the sofa, his fingers interlocked, thinking for a long time. "I still love Alyssa," he said slowly, "but I'm afraid going back now would throw us right back into the same cycle." I nodded. "You're right. Both of you need time. I want to start over, not as husband and wife, but as two people trying to heal." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Then you're already more mature than you were before, Nathan." The following weeks passed with a completely new rhythm, a rhythm I never thought I would experience at my age. Nathan woke up earlier, took walks around the neighborhood each morning. When he got back, he often helped me in the kitchen making coffee or preparing a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and fruit. Alyssa moved in with her mother. They rented a small apartment just enough for 2 bedrooms. Not luxurious, but peaceful and far brighter than the shadowed mansion Harold once ruled. She texted me every week, telling me about the job she found at a local clothing shop. Not fancy, but work she earned with her own hands. One afternoon, Alyssa came to my house to bring over some paperwork Nathan had left behind long ago. When I opened the door, she stood there with a soft smile, her face no longer wearing fear. "I want to help you cook dinner." She said it timidly but with determination, like a family. I looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, I didn't see her as an extension of the Hart family. I saw her simply as herself. "All right," I said. "I could use an extra pair of hands." We washed vegetables, chopped onions, rinsed chicken, and talked about ordinary things women talk about while cooking. Rising grocery prices, a windy morning, stories of how Nathan was afraid of the dark when he was little. Nathan came home while we were making chicken soup. When he saw Alyssa in the kitchen, he paused. Not the kind of pause that comes from pain. The kind that comes from realizing hope might still exist. "Hey," Nathan said softly. "Hi," Alyssa replied, her hand slightly trembling but her eyes no longer avoiding his. I stood to the side, pretending to fuss with the pot, but my heart warmed. Not because they might get back together. I didn't know and didn't want to force it, but because I saw 2 young people learning how to rise from the wreckage. In late-night conversations, Nathan spoke more about the feeling of being manipulated. He didn't say it with self-blame. He spoke like someone looking, directly at a wound so it could finally heal. "I thought I was strong," he said, "but I didn't understand that all I wanted was to feel valued, and Harold knew that." "Knowing you were once weak isn't shameful," I said. "What matters is you stood up." Nathan leaned back against the sofa and closed his eyes. "Mom, without you, I think I would have lost everything." I placed my hand over his. "No, you only lost what you never truly had." One evening near the end of summer, the 3 of us, me, Nathan, and Alyssa, sat down to dinner together. No commitments, no promises, no pressure. Just a simple meal among 3 people trying to heal. I looked at them and realized, family isn't always made of marriage certificates or grand ceremonies. Sometimes family is simply the people who choose to sit together after the storm, even when they're still scared, still hurting, but they choose to stay. I knew the road ahead would be uneven. What happened to Harold the court would handle. What happened to Hart and Sons the investors would pursue. What happened to Nathan and Alyssa, time would decide. But I also knew this: justice sometimes comes at a painful cost, but it is a cost worth paying so the people you love can live truthfully. I stood up to clear the table, watching the 2 young people exchange small conversations, and my heart softened. I had fought. I had lost sleep. I had endured being misunderstood. But in the end, I saved my son. And I found peace again in this home. A peace not perfect, but true. A new beginning. Slow, humble, but full of hope. I always believed that time doesn't heal everything, but it reveals everything. For Harold Hart, that happened faster than anyone expected. Less than 2 months after the ruined wedding, the official trial began. The news spread across Arizona, showing Harold entering the courthouse in a wrinkled suit, his hair unkempt, his face worn as if he had aged 10 years. I didn't want to watch the whole trial. I already knew exactly what would be presented. As prosecutors listed the charges, I felt like I was hearing Caleb's notes read aloud, one by one, embezzling community project funds, creating fake material records, financial fraud, falsifying data, using someone else's identity for unlawful withdrawals. Each accusation sounded like another nail in the coffin of the reputation Harold had built with a polished facade for decades. I looked around the courtroom. Many who once applauded Harold at public events now stared at the floor, unable to look up. Sharon didn't come. Alyssa didn't either. Nathan chose to stay home. Those Harold once threatened, workers, subcontractors, came in large numbers. They wanted to witness the moment the law finally called the truth by its name. Harold sat at the defendant's table, hands clenched together. It was the first time I'd seen him without his usual sense of authority. No sharpness in his eyes, no confident smile, no gold ring he loved to flaunt at gatherings. All that remained was a man being swallowed by the life he created. When the judge read the sentence, I saw Harold lean slightly forward, as if needing something to hold on to so he wouldn't collapse. Defendant Harold Hart is hereby sentenced, with total penalties and custodial time as prescribed by law. The sound of the gavel echoed like a bell closing an era built on lies. Reporters shot up from their seats. Cameras flashed nonstop. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I only felt a heavy sadness. Some people dig their own graves with greed, but the saddest part isn't watching them fall. It's seeing the innocent get pulled down with them. A few days later, the prison clerk called me. "Mrs. Lane, Mrs. Hart. Oh, I mean, Mrs. Lane, the inmate Harold Hart is requesting to meet you." I hesitated. Since the wedding, I never imagined seeing him again. But I also knew nothing truly ends until the last questions are spoken. "I'll come," I said, "but I won't stay long." That afternoon, the Scottsdale wind was strong. I walked into the visitation room, surrounded by cold gray walls, the dim yellow lights making everything look tired and faded. When Harold was brought in, I went silent for a few seconds. The man in front of me was no longer the Harold Hart I once knew. The man who walked with elite confidence, wore watches worth thousands, and held his head high as if the world was beneath his feet. He wore an orange prison uniform and his hands still trembled slightly. When he saw me, Harold paused and lowered his head, something I never thought I would witness. "Mrs. Lane," he said, his voice hoarse and broken, "thank you for coming." I sat down and placed my handbag beside me. "I only have 15 minutes. Harold gave a faint, sad smile. "I won't keep you long." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that once signed countless contracts and directed hundreds of employees, now trembling, frail like those of a sick old man. "Why did you do it?" he asked. No accusation, no anger, just the confusion of someone who no longer had anything to hold on to. I looked at him and answered slowly. "I didn't destroy you, Harold. I only brought the truth to light. You destroyed yourself." Harold closed his eyes for a long moment. His shoulders shook, the first time I had ever seen him cry. Not loud, not like the outburst at the wedding, just slow tears falling, heavy like drops of late regret. "I was too arrogant," he whispered. "I thought I could control everything. I thought reputation was everything." "And you lost everything to protect that," I replied softly. Harold nodded, lifting a hand to cover his face. "I lost 2 children, lost Sharon, lost Alyssa, and the second family, Hart and Sons. Everything." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "But what hurts the most is that I lost myself." I said nothing. Neither of us needed to add more blame. Life had spoken on our behalf. After a long while, he looked up at me, his eyes swollen and red. "Do you hate me?" I shook my head. "I don't hate you, Harold. I'm only sad that greed turned you into someone you were never meant to become." He let out a crooked smile, then said, "If I hadn't met you that day, maybe I never would have been exposed." "I'm not the problem," I answered. "The problem is you lived too long on a lie." Harold nodded, as if he finally accepted what the rest of the world had realized long before him. When the prison officer stepped in to announce that time was up, Harold tried to speak quickly. "Mrs. Lane, if you ever see Nathan and Alyssa, tell them I'm sorry." I stood up and picked up my handbag. "I'll tell them," I said, "but whether they forgive you, that's their choice." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the ruin Harold had caused himself one more time. That was the last time in my life I ever saw him. When I stepped out of the prison building, the evening wind blew hard. The sky was strangely clear, as if the storm named Harold Hart had finally blown out of my life and out of the lives of those I loved. I stood on the steps and took a long breath. Not a breath of victory, but a breath of closure. A chapter had ended, a lesson had been completed, and justice, even painful justice, had finally been carried out. I walked toward the parking lot, the late afternoon sunlight warming my shoulders like a reminder. Truth always arrives, late or painful, but it comes to free the people who need to be freed, and I knew I had done the right thing. A year after Harold was sentenced, our lives had shifted into a different rhythm. Slower, steadier, and peaceful in a way I never believed I could have again. Scottsdale was still sunny, still full of desert winds in the evenings, but inside my small family, a new season had begun. Nathan and Alyssa decided to have a new wedding, not to compensate for the collapse of the first one, but to mark a true beginning, one not built on status, money, or empty praise. They chose a small church on the outskirts of town with light brown wooden beams and stained glass windows. It was the place where, the previous fall, Alyssa had spent hours sitting in silence, searching for her peace. This wedding didn't have 200 guests, no champagne poured into imported crystal, no arrogant smile from Harold, no judgmental glances from relatives, no whispers from people who only came to see who was richer. They invited only the people who truly mattered, those who stood by them during the hardest times, a few old friends of Nathan's, Alyssa's new co-workers, and the neighbors who supported me from the beginning. I stood inside the church, a light shawl across my shoulders, watching my son walk toward the altar. Nathan wore a simple navy suit, not expensive tailoring, but his eyes shone brighter than any gemstone. Alyssa followed behind, her white dress gentle as the breeze, her smile trembling yet innocent. No boasting, no insults, no looks of judgment, only love, pure and full. When they exchanged vows again, I felt each word sink deep into my heart. The first time they vowed before a world built on pretenses. This time, they vowed before their true selves. I stood nearby, quietly tearing up. For the first time in more than 2 years, I felt I had truly done the right thing. Right from the beginning, right in the deepest sense, right in a way that freed my heart. After the ceremony, we held a small outdoor reception behind the church. Just a few wooden tables, wild flowers in glass jars, a homemade wedding cake. Not grand, but beautiful in a way only sincerity can be. Alyssa held my hand and whispered, "Mrs. Lane, without you, I don't think I ever could have escaped that life." I gently patted the back of her hand. "No, you freed yourself. I only opened a door. You walked through it." Nathan came over and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Mom," he said, "I used to blame you, but now I'm proud to have a mother as brave as you." I laughed and tapped his arm lightly. "I'm not brave. I'm just a mother who knew her son deserved to live truthfully." Nathan pulled me into a hug, so different from the heavy hug after the storm first passed. This one was a hug of peace, of unconditional love. After the wedding, the three of us gradually settled into a new rhythm. Nathan joined a small but reputable construction company where he was valued for his real abilities. No more tense elite dinners, no more keeping up appearances to please anyone. Alyssa stayed with the job she found at the clothing store. They weren't wealthy, but she had a freedom she had never experienced before. Many evenings we ate together in my little kitchen. Alyssa shared stories about difficult customers. Nathan shared stories about funny coworkers. I listened, sometimes adding old memories, and my heart felt lighter. The things I had always wished for, honesty, peace, love without pretense, finally existed right in front of me. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch sipping tea, Nathan suddenly said, "Mom, I think I finally understand what you always taught me. The truth, no matter how harsh, is what frees people." I looked at my son for a long moment. As long as you understand that, it's enough. And I know. Nathan continued, "The real value of a person isn't something anyone can trample on unless we allow it." I held his hand. Exactly. No one can take away your worth, not even those who once thought they had the right. Alyssa placed her hand on top of ours and smiled softly. We all learned that in the hardest way. Over the past year, I saw many people come and go from my life. Some came only to stand with me during a few stormy weeks. Some stayed and became new family. But no matter what, I realized something simple. When you live truthfully, when you refuse to bow to lies, the people who deserve you will find their way to you. I've lived most of my life already, but because of everything that happened, I feel like I just learned a new lesson. One that some people never fully understand. Peace doesn't fall from the sky. It's something you choose. You choose truth. You choose kindness. You choose to stand with what's right. And when you dare to choose, peace will come. As I share this story, I know one thing. You, the person reading or listening, have also faced unfairness at some point. Maybe not from a wealthy in-law family, but from people you loved who didn't understand your worth. If you've ever been looked down on, if you've ever been humiliated, if you've ever been pushed into the shadows because you didn't fit someone else's mold, then remember, your true worth cannot be taken. People can only make you forget it for a while. And once you reclaim it, as I reclaimed it for my son, you enter a whole new chapter of life, a chapter of peace, a chapter of truth, a chapter of your own. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Thank you for giving your time, your heart, and your understanding to this journey. The journey of a mother, a woman growing older but never giving up. And if you are still here, reading these lines, I hope you will stay with me for the next stories I share. Where are you from? Have you ever faced a moment when you had to stand up and protect your own worth? Leave a comment. I would love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe so I can continue sharing real-life stories. Stories of ours, of people who may no longer be young, but still have so much to say. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. Don't step inside. Get out of here now. Rosa, the housekeeper, rushed toward me and grabbed my arm just as I set foot on my daughter's front steps. Her face had gone pale, as if she'd just seen death itself. I froze, my heart pounding, unable to understand what was happening in the very house I had once helped my daughter pay half the mortgage for. I opened my mouth to ask, but she backed away, glancing toward the door as though terrified someone might hear. "If you stay here one more minute, you won't have a chance to walk out of this place." I stepped back toward my car, but instead of leaving, I turned off the lights, lowered my seat, and watched. And then, what I saw through the dining room window made everything inside me collapse. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Caroline Mercer, and I'm 57 years old. Just a few hours before hearing that terrifying warning, I had believed today would be the best day I'd had in an entire year. A long, agonizing year of silence, unanswered calls, messages slipping into the void like pain tossed into a dark sky. It all began with a text message, one short line that shattered every bit of emotional armor I'd built over the past year. "Mom, can we have dinner together next Thursday? I miss you." Grace, my only daughter, the child who used to hug me every night, who once said I was the best friend in the world, who cried when she left for college, yet suddenly disappeared from my life one day as if I had never existed. No argument, no clear reason, just distance widening day after day, unread messages, declined calls. Layer after layer, my daughter slowly slipped from my hands into a world I could no longer reach. A world where Landon Reeves, her husband, controlled every door. And yet that day, my phone buzzed, and with one message, all the pain and hope rushed back into me in the cruelest way. I read that message dozens of times, each time my heart beat harder. I told myself, maybe she really misses me. Maybe she finally realized her mother never did anything wrong. Maybe everything can start over. So I prepared. Too much, honestly, for an ordinary dinner. I changed clothes 5 times, checked the mirror a dozen more. I decided to wear the light blue sweater Grace gave me 3 years ago. The last Christmas, we were truly mother and daughter. Driving into Grace's upscale neighborhood, Snow Pine Estates on the outskirts of Denver, my heart fluttered like a woman on her first date in decades. But the moment I parked, I sensed something was off. The front yard was bare, no longer filled with the hydrangeas we planted together when Grace first moved in. The porch light was dimmer than usual. There was no sense of home, no warmth at all, only a cold emptiness like a frozen lake. I stepped out of the car, smoothed my wind-tousled hair, and took a deep breath to steady myself. I was about to attend our first reconciliation dinner after a year of estrangement. I had rehearsed a simple line for days. "Grace, I'm glad you texted me." But before I could use it, Rosa came running. Her sudden yank nearly knocked me off balance. Her face was flushed, her breathing uneven. I had never seen her like this. Rosa was always calm, gentle, someone who cared for Grace as if she were her own child. What she said wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. When she rushed back inside, her shoulders shaking as though afraid of being seen, a cold shiver ran the length of my spine. I returned to my car, shut the door, and locked it. But instead of driving away, I turned off all the lights, slid low in my seat, and peered through the narrow gap where the curtains didn't cover the window. At first, nothing. The house was dark, unnervingly still. But then, almost as if someone had waited for me to leave, lights flickered on room by room. Each window lit up like the opening scene of a carefully staged play. A man in a black suit appeared in the dining room, then a woman holding a folder, and then Landon walked in. One glance was enough to recognize that arrogant stride. He talked on the phone, pacing like he was leading a strategic briefing. But the cruelest part had yet to come. Grace stepped inside moments later. My daughter, her face unrecognizable. No smile, no warmth, only a chilling emptiness. She looked at the stack of papers on the table and signed them. No hesitation, no doubt. My heart clenched painfully. A year of absolute silence from her, no explanation. And now, signing documents? For whom? For what purpose? Was I dreaming? I leaned forward against the steering wheel, fighting the urge to sob. A familiar instinct suddenly surged back, one I thought I had buried long ago. The instinct of someone who spent 15 years living inside a violent marriage. Someone who had learned to sense danger the moment it entered the room. That instinct was screaming inside my head now. This wasn't a reconciliation dinner. This wasn't a daughter reaching out. This wasn't healing. This was a plan, a private meeting. And strangely, it had only started once I supposedly left, but I hadn't left. I was still there, and Landon looked straight toward me. I ducked down reflexively, my heart pounding like a drum. When I glanced again seconds later, the curtains had been pulled shut. The house vanished behind thick gray fabric, as if they knew I was seeing something I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't sit there anymore. I started the engine and drove away, my hands trembling so hard I struggled to keep the wheel steady. But leaving that house didn't bring relief. If anything, as the streetlights blurred into streaks of white outside my window, I realized I had just stepped into the biggest storm of my life. And one question stabbed through my mind over and over: was Grace being coerced? Or was my own daughter silently participating in a scheme against me? I drove away from Grace's neighborhood in a daze, as if everything I had just witnessed were a nightmare that hadn't finished unfolding. It wasn't until the glow of a gas station appeared on the right that I finally pulled in. I parked, lowered the window to let the night air in, hoping it would loosen the tightness in my chest. The smell of gasoline, the hiss of automated doors, the harsh white lights, all painfully ordinary. Meanwhile, I was shaking, trying to piece together what I'd just seen into something that made sense. I placed both hands on the wheel, but they wouldn't stop trembling. The air in the car felt heavy, almost suffocating. I tried recalling Grace's expression as she signed those papers. Cold, hollow. Not the face of the daughter I raised for more than 20 years. Not the child who once gave me a Mother's Day card with trembling handwriting. "Mom, you are my safe place." Tears threatened, but my throat locked tight. My phone lit up. A message from an unknown number. "It's me, Rosa. Don't go back to the house. Don't tell anyone. Meet me tomorrow at noon at the cafe inside the central station. Important." The word important sent a chill through me. I read it again, then tucked my phone inside the chest pocket of my jacket, afraid it might vanish if I put it anywhere else. Driving home, every street sign, every familiar corner felt strangely distant. I unlocked my apartment, stepped into my quiet living room, yet the unease followed me inside like a shadow. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my armchair by the window, staring at the city lights. Skyscrapers glowing gold, cars moving slowly along the freeway, lives continuing as usual while mine felt like it had been yanked off its axis. I imagined countless scenarios: Grace being pressured, Grace being deceived, or Grace truly believing the things Landon had told her. That possibility hurt more than my divorce ever did. I could recognize violence, I could fight against lies, but my own daughter believing I was toxic, that was a wound with no bandage. I remembered her freshman year of college, a whole week without calling. When I visited unannounced, she hugged me and cried from academic stress. A simple touch from me eased her breathing. But after she married Landon, everything changed. At first, subtly, vague excuses Grace made. We're busy. It's not a good time to talk. I'm just living my own life, Mom. I didn't realize it then, but each line was a step away from me. The day Grace got married, she looked beautiful, glowing, and Landon never let go of her waist, gripping her like he owned her. I didn't like that hand from the start. It was too tight, too possessive. But I told myself, Caroline, don't judge. He's the man your daughter loves. A year later, Grace was visibly thinner. Her close friends drifted away. My calls grew shorter, whispers from her that she was tired, that she was fine, and don't worry. But her voice said otherwise. Now looking back, every sign was painfully obvious. The next day, I met Rosa at the Central Bus Station Cafe, a crowded place where no one noticed anyone else. I arrived 20 minutes early, sitting near the window, watching people hurry by. My hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I couldn't drink. Rosa arrived exactly at noon. She wore a knit hat and a dark scarf, her small frame tense as her eyes darted around the room. When she spotted me, her shoulders sagged with relief. She sat down and took my hands. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm so sorry I didn't speak sooner." I didn't have time to respond before she lowered her voice, scanning the room again. "Mr. Landon controls everything, every meal, every call, every person Grace is allowed to meet, even what she thinks." My eyes widened. Rosa explained it piece by piece. How Landon dictated Grace's diet, forcing her to stay on harsh regimens though she was already slim. How he checked her phone every morning. How he insisted she sleep 8 hours, not for her health, but to keep her from seeing anyone. And worst of all, he convinced her you're the problem, that you want to ruin their life, that you're jealous. I clenched my fist, trying to keep my voice steady, though my chest felt like it was being beaten from the inside. Grace believes that? Rosa looked down. She doesn't know what to believe anymore. Everything she hears comes from one person. A long, uncomfortable silence followed. I heard rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, a crying child, all muffled, like they belonged to a world far from mine. Then Rosa said the words that shattered me. "He needs your signature. For the old house. For the shares her father left her. He said once he gets your signature, everything will be done." The room tilted. I gripped the table so I wouldn't fall. But Rosa wasn't finished. Her voice shook now. "Yesterday, I overheard them. That dinner wasn't about reconciliation. They planned to create an accident so you wouldn't be able to interfere." I looked into Rosa's frightened eyes, and all I could think about was Grace. Grace, my daughter. Grace, the child who held my hand on the first day of school. Grace, who once believed no one loved her more than her mother. Did she know? Was she being coerced? Or had she been manipulated into believing my death would make her life easier? I couldn't breathe. I had to inhale deeply 3 times just to stop myself from crying out in pain. The room blurred like someone had splashed water across a painting. One thing became painfully clear. If I didn't act, I would lose my daughter. Forever. Rosa opened her bag and pulled out a thick envelope wrapped in 2 layers of paper. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the table. I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a stack of documents bearing my signature. My signature, but not mine. The loops were too long. The ending stroke dragged out. One glance, and I knew they were forged. There are also ones with Miss Grace's, Rosa whispered. I turned the pages. Grace's signatures looked disturbingly real, but I knew my daughter's handwriting. She always tilted the G slightly upward, writing quickly and neatly. These signatures were slow, cautious, copied strokes. A small audio recorder slid out of the envelope. I pressed play, my hand gripping the table. Landon's voice, low, calculated. All we need is her signature. Grace's mother won't question anything if it all looks natural. We can't let her get in the way. Rosa swallowed hard. I heard it while taking the trash out behind the yard. I couldn't speak anymore. Not because I was shocked, but because I was holding myself together so I wouldn't fall apart in public. Part of me wanted to run, grab Grace and drag her away from that man. But the part of me that survived 15 years of abuse knew impulsiveness would only make us both targets. We could take this to the police, Rosa whispered, almost pleading. I met her eyes. We can't. Not yet. Landon had wide connections in the city. He wasn't famous, but his father had once been chairman of the local Chamber of Commerce, a man with significant influence. A formal report could be diluted or, worse, turned into evidence against me. If I handed over what Rosa gave me to the police right now, there was a high chance I'd be labeled as a family disruptor before anyone bothered to look at the truth. I needed someone I could trust, and only one name came to mind: Harold Bishop, an old friend from college, now an attorney specializing in asset disputes and fraud. Harold was a quiet, straightforward man, and most importantly, he had no ties whatsoever to Landon's family. Right there in the cafe, I called Harold. His voice came through after 2 rings. Caroline, it's been years. Are you all right? No, Harold, I think I'm in danger. The moment I said it out loud, my throat tightened. I had never spoken those words before. And once I did, the fear stopped being hypothetical and became real. I briefly explained what Rosa had revealed. Harold fell silent for a long moment, the only sound being the rustle of papers in his office. Then he said, "Listen to me carefully. Your old documents, the ones related to your previous home and the shares your late husband left, where are they?" "In a green folder, inside the safe under my desk." Harold lowered his voice, so serious it sent a shiver through me. "That is the only evidence protecting you right now. And Caroline, do not go home alone. I'm coming to meet you. Do not hang up." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. After we ended the call, I thanked Rosa and told her to go home using different routes to avoid anyone tracing our meeting. I left the central station feeling as if I were walking between 2 worlds. The world I once knew, peaceful, stable, and the world of shadows slowly swallowing me. By the time my car stopped in front of my apartment, Harold was already there waiting. But he wasn't standing normally. He was pressed against the doorframe, staring at me with a face nearly drained of color. "Caroline, your apartment was ransacked." My knees nearly gave out. We walked in together. The door hadn't been forced. Someone had either used a key or knew how to work the smart lock without leaving a trace. Inside was a scene I never imagined I would witness in my own life. The safe under my desk was wide open, drawers pulled out, papers scattered as if someone had been searching for something valuable. But the only thing missing was the green folder. I held my head in my hands, standing in the middle of the wrecked living room. Harold handed me a glass of water, speaking in a calming voice. "You need to stay composed. Someone knew you kept those documents. But they don't know I made partial copies earlier. I'll send them to you immediately." I stared at him, stunned. How did they know? Harold didn't hesitate. Grace didn't tell him, but Landon could guess. He's smart enough to understand that you would always hold on to evidence related to your and your daughter's assets. I barely had time to process his words when my phone rang. It was the library where I worked part-time. Ms. Mercer, we just received an anonymous report accusing you of financial misconduct while overseeing the library's donation fund. My legs went weak. I almost dropped the phone. I've never done that, I stammered. We know, but by policy, we must place you on temporary suspension while we investigate. I hung up and looked at Harold with a face drained of expression. Caroline, he said slowly, they're building a narrative that you are unstable, greedy, and dishonest. By the time you report them, no one will believe you. I couldn't find words. I felt myself being pushed into a corner by an invisible but powerful hand. Landon's hand. The phone buzzed again. A message from Rosa. They mentioned Plan B. It's not just about the assets. It's about Grace. My head felt like it exploded. I read it over and over, each word cutting into my skin. Plan B, not me, but Grace. I looked at Harold, my voice trembling uncontrollably. Where do they plan to take Grace? Harold looked at me carefully, choosing his words. Caroline, I've heard Landon has financial dealings with an overseas partner. If he gets Grace out of the country before you act, we won't be able to find her again. The room spun. My breathing seized. On one hand, I knew that if I stayed involved, my life could be in danger. On the other hand, if I did nothing, Grace would disappear from my life forever. In that moment, I knew I had only two choices: run to save myself or fight, even if it meant risking everything. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, then opened them with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had survived domestic violence. I had rebuilt my life from nothing. I was not giving up this time, not when my daughter was being swallowed by darkness. I left my ransacked apartment that very night without packing clothes or taking anything familiar. Harold told me to drive straight to my cousin's house in the Santa Fe area, a remote place, quiet, and most importantly, unknown to anyone connected to Landon. As I drove, the low mountain ranges appeared under the pale moonlight, stretching like a fragile curtain between me and the world Landon was trying to control. When I arrived, my cousin Sylvia's small wooden house stood beneath an old birch tree. The warm porch light nearly brought me to tears. I had grown used to feeling hunted, but being greeted by someone, even a distant relative, reminded me I still had places where I belonged. Sylvia looked me over and asked just one gentle question. How long? A few days, I said softly. Maybe longer. She nodded immediately, as if she had always expected something like this. You're safe here. Rest. Talk tomorrow. But I knew I couldn't sleep. After a bowl of warm soup, I sat alone at the small wooden table by the window, replaying the audio files and examining each forged document Rosa had given me. Signatures, fake transfers, carefully fabricated records so precise they made my skin crawl. In that quiet Santa Fe room, I finally saw the situation from enough distance to understand that this wasn't just a broken family matter. It was an orchestrated plan, structured and deliberate, crafted by a man skilled in manipulation. The next morning, Harold arrived in Santa Fe. With him were two people he said would become critical allies: Troy Callahan, a retired detective who had handled domestic abuse cases, and Dr. Evelyn Moore, a specialist in coercive control and trauma bonding. From the moment I saw them, I knew I was no longer facing this storm alone. Troy entered with the presence of a man who had seen far too much darkness, but still carried compassion in his eyes. He didn't shake my hand. He simply looked at me and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I've heard everything, and I want you to understand something right now. You're not imagining this. It's real." That sentence alone eased half my burden. Evelyn was different, gentle, grounded, with eyes that seemed to read through every defense. When I described how Grace changed, her weight loss, her fear of answering the phone, her avoidance of friends, her constant anxiety, Evelyn nodded as if hearing a familiar story. "That's coercive control," she explained. "Not physical abuse, but far more damaging. The victim loses willpower, loses the ability to distinguish truth from manipulation, and becomes completely dependent on the abuser." I clenched my hands. But Grace is smart. She's been strong since she was little. Evelyn placed her hand on the table and said firmly, "Intelligence doesn't shield anyone from a skilled manipulator. In fact, intelligent people are often targeted because they know how to endure, rationalize, and silence their own doubts." A heavy silence filled the room. Troy stood up, arms crossed. "If Landon is preparing to take Grace out of the country, we don't have much time." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "If he crosses a border with her, no one can demand extradition. Without evidence, without legal jurisdiction, she'll disappear from the United States and from your life." I felt myself turn to stone. I had feared it, but hearing it aloud made it undeniable. Harold spread a map on the table. "We need a plan. We can't wait for him to move first." I looked at these three people, strangers technically, giving their time, expertise, and safety for me and for a young woman they'd never met. Gratitude nearly overwhelmed me. Troy outlined the plan. His only weak point is his work schedule. Landon travels once a month. If we know his next trip, we get a window of a few hours. The only time Grace won't be monitored closely. I remembered Rosa's words. "He's flying to Phoenix next week. Board meeting." Troy circled the date. "Good. That's when we move." But the tasks ahead were daunting. Rosa would monitor the inside and alert us when Landon left. Harold would handle legal preparation and federal contact if needed. Troy would secure the home and guide the extraction. Evelyn would make first contact with Grace, easing her panic and helping her see the truth. When Evelyn described her role, I asked, "Will Grace trust you?" Evelyn gave a sad, soft smile. "Trust isn't required. What matters is breaking the mental loop he built. A few minutes without him in the room can create an opening." On paper, the plan looked simple. In reality, we all knew one mistake could ruin everything. I swallowed hard. What if we fail? Troy didn't hesitate. "Failure isn't an option. We're rescuing someone trapped in a violent dynamic. We won't let anyone get dragged out of this country like property." Harold placed a hand on my shoulder. "Caroline, when we step in, we're not just helping you. We're saving a life." That sentence made my knees weak. Grace, my baby, the child I held in my arms when she was 3 days old, now needed a rescue like a hostage. Evelyn looked at me. "Prepare yourself emotionally. When we find Grace, she might resist. She might blame you or deny everything. That's normal when a victim is separated from their controller." I inhaled deeply. As long as she's alive, I can endure anything. After they left to prepare, I remained on Sylvia's porch, watching the Santa Fe sky dim behind the hills. The air was peaceful, yet I felt the weight of how narrowly I stood between saving my daughter and losing her forever. That night, Sylvia placed a warm hand on my shoulder. "Don't fall apart, Carolyn. I know you. You don't give up. Later, I stepped outside into the cold night air. The wind smelled faintly of distant snow. I looked toward Denver, toward Grace, and whispered into the dark, "Grace, I'm coming. Don't be afraid. Don't let go. I will get you out of there, whatever it takes." And just like that, the countdown to the biggest battle of my life began. Rosa messaged exactly as promised. "He's gone. 11:02. Took luggage. House alarm disabled. Now or never." I stared at the message, my hands cold as metal in winter. In the driver's seat, Troy gave a single nod, sharp, decisive, then looked back at Harold and Evelyn. Everyone was ready. Only I had to steady my breath. We parked 3 houses away from the gated entrance. From there, the steel fence, guard booth, and cameras of North Ridge Estates looked like the front of a fortress. But Troy knew how to neutralize intimidation. He put on a UPS delivery uniform Harold had prepared, plus a cap pulled low. He held an empty cardboard box labeled fragile. 15 years in law enforcement had taught him one thing. Sometimes the best way into a secure place was to look utterly harmless. "Stay calm," Troy whispered before stepping out. "We get one chance, but don't worry, I've gotten into places much harder than this." He walked to the gate. The camera scanned him. The guard glanced at the box, pressed a button, and opened the gate as if on autopilot. No questions asked. The gate opened, and the plan began. Troy walked deeper into the neighborhood, and our car followed the internal route unnoticed. Approaching the 3rd house on the right, Grace's, we slowed, stopping under a large tree that hid us from the entrance cameras. As promised, Rosa had left the back door slightly ajar. The curtain flickered gently in the breeze, like a silent plea. When we stepped inside, I sensed immediately the wrong kind of quiet. Not the peace of an empty home, but the heavy silence of a place where life had been stripped away and replaced with control. Nothing was out of place. Not a cushion. Not a single item left casually on a table. No smell of food, no background TV noise. Nothing indicating that Grace had been allowed to live as a normal human being. Rosa emerged from the hallway, pale and signaling us to stay silent. "She's in the living room. Her spirit is almost gone." We walked toward the living room doorway. I stepped in first, and my heart nearly dropped to the floor. Grace curled up on the sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket even though the house was warm. Her once soft hair was tangled and flat, as if life had drained out of it. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes sunken and vacant. My daughter, who used to love jogging every morning, who used to smile brightly after yoga class, now looked as if she had survived a storm that had lasted an entire year. I stepped inside. "Grace?" She lifted her head, and panic flooded her eyes instantly. "Mom, you can't be here!" Her voice cracked like shattering glass. "If he finds out, you have to leave now. You don't understand. You can't be here." I didn't even have time to speak before Evelyn stepped forward softly, her voice like a gentle cloth draped over Grace's terror. "Grace, I'm Evelyn. No one is here to cause trouble. We're here to help, to protect you." Grace looked around, her eyes darting between us, as if desperately trying to decide who was a threat. It was the look of someone who had been controlled for so long that she no longer knew how to distinguish safety from danger. I sat down 2 steps away from her, not any closer. Evelyn said Grace needed space, not pressure. I gently took out my phone and opened the message I had received the day before, the message she sent, inviting me to dinner. "Grace," I said, showing her the screen, "this message, did you actually write it?" She stared at the screen, squinting, then slowly shook her head, not to deny me, but as if trying to remember something. I didn't write this. Her voice was so soft I had to lean in to hear it. That single sentence made my heart tighten. Harold continued. He opened his briefcase and took out the photos Rosa had captured, the forged transfer documents with fake signatures of me and Grace. If you had signed these, you would remember, Harold said as gently as possible. But this signature isn't yours. And then I saw what I feared most, and also what I hoped for most. Grace's hand began to tremble, not from anger, not from resenting me, but from fear, and from realizing something was wrong. No, that's impossible, Grace whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Rosa slowly stepped forward from behind the door, her eyes filled with pain as she looked at Grace. Ms. Grace, I heard him talking about an accident for your mother, a fall down the stairs, red wine, something that would look natural. Grace jerked her head up. No, he wouldn't, he's not like that. The word shot out like a spring, reflexively defending Landon, but her eyes no longer matched her voice. I looked straight at my daughter. I didn't accuse her. I didn't judge her. I simply asked, with all the ache inside me, Grace, do you trust him more than your own mother? A simple question, but enough to create the first crack in the wall Landon had built around her mind. Grace grabbed her head as if our words were fighting inside her skull. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice a soft thread wrapping around Grace's frayed spirit. What you're feeling right now, confusion, fear, not knowing who to trust, it's the clearest sign of psychological control. When you stop trusting yourself, when you stop trusting your own memories, it's because someone has taken that away from you. Tears began to fall down Grace's cheeks, first slowly, then all at once, like a dam breaking. I thought he loved me, she choked out. I thought he wanted what was best for me. I couldn't stay back anymore. I took one step toward her, each step feeling like walking through fire. Grace, I once believed the same thing about your father. My voice shook, and it took me years to escape. Grace looked up at me, really looked, for the first time in months. Mom? Just one word, but inside it was confusion, hurt, realization, and despair. Harold set the forged documents on the table. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Grace's shoulder. Rosa stood behind her, nodding, affirming everything Grace was terrified to admit. And then, the moment I had waited for over a year finally came. Grace inhaled shakily, her eyes red but clearer now, no longer cloudy with fear. She looked at me, directly, without avoiding, without flinching. Her voice was hoarse but firm. Mom, I want to leave. No alarm blared, no door slammed, no sound intruded on that moment, just a mother and her daughter. And for the first time in a long, painful year, I saw light return to her eyes. And I knew this was only the first step, but it was the most important one. The step that brought my daughter back to herself. Troy checked his watch, then looked at me and Evelyn, his voice low but sharp. We have to go now. He's due for a check-in. If Landon calls and Grace doesn't answer, or if her voice sounds off, he'll turn around immediately. Grace flinched, clutching the blanket around her like a fragile shield. Her breathing sped up, her hands squeezed together until her knuckles went white. Fear had rooted so deeply in her body that just hearing Landon's name sent her trembling. Rosa rushed to the kitchen, grabbed the phone Landon forced Grace to carry 24/7. She powered it off, removed the SIM, and handed it to Troy. He uses tracking software, Rosa whispered. I'm not sure turning it off is enough, but at least he can't follow the signal. Troy nodded and slipped the SIM into his pocket. No trace left behind. Let's go. Everything happened in seconds, but to me it felt like a lifetime. I put a coat on Grace, held her hand, and guided her toward the back door. Every step felt like stepping onto thin ice. I feared the creak of a floorboard, the squeak of a hinge, even the whisper of the wind. Evelyn stayed close, her hand on Grace's back to steady her breath. When we reached the yard, Troy scanned the surroundings. The garden was washed in pale afternoon light. No movement, no suspicious sound, only Grace's shaky breathing and my pounding heart. "Go," he whispered. We crossed the yard, slipping through the side path toward the back alley. Harold's black SUV waited under the shade of a large tree, engine humming softly. I opened the back door and helped Grace in. She trembled so violently she clutched my shoulders and asked 3 times, "Is he coming? Does he know? Can he see us?" I stroked her hair. "No, sweetheart. We're leaving safely." But my own heart was racing just as fast. When Harold pressed the gas, the car rolled forward, pulling us away from the house where my daughter had lived in fear for months. Troy reclined slightly, watching the rearview mirror nonstop. By the time we approached the community gate, my pulse was a drum inside my throat. The guard stood in the road, phone in hand, his face tense. As we drove past, he spoke quickly into the phone. "Yes, I'm checking. Let me review the rear cameras." Harold accelerated just as the guard looked up. But because our license plate belonged to Harold's law firm, which frequently entered the community, he didn't question it. We passed through. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, but relief lasted only 5 seconds. Rosa's phone rang. The piercing sound exploded inside the silent car. Rosa glanced at the screen, her lips paling. "It's him." No one spoke. Only the hum of the engine filled the space. Rosa answered, switching to low speaker mode as planned. "Yes, sir? I'm at the market. Is something—" Landon's scream was so loud I flinched. "Someone broke into the house! The back door was unlocked! What are you hiding? Where's Grace?" Grace clamped her hands over her ears, curling into a tight ball. Troy motioned for Harold to go faster. Evelyn put her arm around Grace to keep her from collapsing. "Sir, I wasn't there. I just stepped out to shop," Rosa said, trembling. "Don't lie to me," he roared. "I'm coming back now. If anything has happened, you know the consequences." Rosa swallowed hard. "I don't know anything, sir." The call cut abruptly. No goodbye, no warning, just dead silence. In that moment, I understood one thing. We had won the first round, but he had just realized he'd lost control, and that would make him more dangerous than ever. Grace broke into sobs, not from relief, but from the panic triggered by his voice, a voice she had lived under for far too long. "He'll find me," Grace whispered. "He always finds me." I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her whole body shaking. "No, Grace, not anymore. You're going far away from him now." Troy turned toward the back seat, his voice firm. "You're safe. I promise. I've dealt with men like him, and I know how to stop them." But Evelyn added softly, not to frighten Grace, but to prepare me. "Caroline, I must tell you something. The period right after a victim escapes is the most dangerous phase. This is when the abuser has lost all control, and they become unpredictable. He could turn into a maniac. Very hard to anticipate." I squeezed Grace's hand tighter, my own heart clenching. "No matter what he does," I whispered into her hair, "I won't let him touch you again." We drove into the outskirts where the city faded into lonely hills and old wooden fences. After nearly an hour, Harold turned onto a dirt path leading to Troy's family ranch. "No one will find this place," Troy said. "No GPS, poor signal, no neighbors close enough to see anything. Only my family ever knew about it. And they're gone." The old wooden house appeared in the open field, its roof weathered, its porch overlooking distant mountains. It was peacefully quiet, almost too quiet. We stopped. No one moved for several seconds, as if all of us needed time to come down from the rush of escape. I helped Grace out of the car. The crisp air made her cough faintly. Then she looked around, her expression still frantic but no longer overwhelmed by panic. Evelyn rested a hand on my shoulder. "You just pulled your daughter out of the hands of a dangerous man, but the journey isn't over. This is Grace's most fragile stage, and the stage when he will be most desperate to pull her back." Troy checked the doors, locked every entry, drew the curtains, and shut off all lights that could be seen from outside. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent years keeping people alive. Grace sat on the old wool-covered sofa. I took her hand, cold, fragile, almost weightless. "Mom, do you think he'll come here?" she whispered. I kissed her hair, my voice breaking. "No, he won't find this place, and I won't let him come near you ever again." Grace finally cried, truly cried, for the first time since we'd entered her house earlier that day. No more automatic apologies for Landon, no more terrified whispers, just the sobs of someone who had finally stepped out of the invisible cage. I held her as our tears blended, and I vowed with everything left in me that I would protect her to the very end. I didn't know how many hours had passed since we reached Troy's ranch. The afternoon light had vanished. Darkness spread across the land. Yet inside the wooden house, the warm glow of the lamps still couldn't calm the storm inside my daughter. Grace stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the pitch-dark field as if Landon could emerge from it at any moment. She flinched at every noise, a branch scraping the roof, the wind squeezing through the cracks. Her whole body was strung tight, ready to snap. "I'm fine," she whispered, but her shaking legs betrayed her. Evelyn stepped close, gently placing her hand on Grace's back. "Breathe in slowly. Count to 4, then exhale gently." Grace followed the instructions, but her breath broke into weak, uneven fragments, like a torn float barely clinging to the surface of the water. "I'm scared. He'll know I ran," she whispered, trembling. "He always knows. Everything. Mom, will he find me?" I stepped closer, placing my hand over her shaking one, gripping it just firmly enough to remind her she was still in the present, not trapped in that house where she had been held by invisible chains. "No one knows we're here," I said. "No one, except the people we trust completely." But Grace couldn't hear my words with her heart. She was still living inside the wound, inside the reflexes carved into her after years of control. Evelyn signaled for Troy to pull the curtains shut. The room became sealed off, safer. The warm light formed a small circle in the darkness, a circle where Grace could finally breathe without feeling watched. "Drink some water," Evelyn said gently. "Your body is reacting to long-term stress. Water will help you settle." Grace held the glass with both hands, sipping it the way someone leaving a desert would. After a few minutes, she sat on the sofa, curling into herself as though she were afraid of taking up too much space. Evelyn sat an appropriate distance away, not too close to pressure her, not too far to make her feel abandoned. "Grace," Evelyn began, her voice soft like a low piano note, "when was the last time you felt truly happy?" Grace was silent for a long time. I thought she wouldn't answer. Then suddenly, a sob rose from her chest. "It was before I married him." She spoke between choked breaths and tears spilled, as if that question had unlocked a door she had kept sealed for years. I felt something inside me fracture. Grace had never told me anything. She always smiled in the photos she sent, always said, "I'm fine," always reassured me, "Don't worry." But her smiles, it turned out, were only masks. Evelyn nodded gently, letting Grace walk toward the truth at her own pace. Back then, Grace swallowed her tears. I wanted a family. I thought he understood me. But after we married, everything changed. She wiped her cheeks, but the tears kept coming. He said I was fat, said I dressed like a child, said I didn't know how to talk. He checked my phone every night, said I didn't need friends, said I didn't need you. My heart clenched when she reached that last word. Evelyn asked softly, "When did you first realize you weren't free?" "When I wanted to visit Mom for her birthday." Grace lifted her swollen eyes. "He threw my car keys away and told me only an ungrateful woman runs around chasing other people on an important day." I believed him. I thought I was really awful. Harold, who had been quietly observing, spoke slowly, without judgment. "That's gaslighting, Grace. He made you believe every problem came from your imagination. That's how an abuser keeps control." Grace clenched her hands tightly. "I know. I changed. I wasn't myself anymore. But I didn't know how to get out." I knelt in front of her and lifted her hands. That's when I saw the faint purple bruise on her left wrist. Deep, unmistakable. "Grace." I froze. "Did he do this?" Grace immediately hid her hand, like someone trained to protect the person who harmed them. No. I did it myself." But her voice trembled, weak and ashamed. Troy, who had seen this too many times, shook his head. "You don't need to protect him here, Grace. We know where that mark came from." Grace broke into sobs, broken, abandoned, childlike cries. He only hit me when I talked back, never where people could see, never hard, just to remind me how to behave." I wrapped my arms around her as my tears fell into her hair. "Oh my God, Grace. How did you endure all this without me knowing?" Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder, not to stop my tears, but to steady me. "Caroline, you are not to blame. Men like Landon hide their violence well. They build a perfect image for the world and show their true face only behind closed doors. You could be the most loving, attentive mother, but you cannot see what they make sure you never see." Then Evelyn turned to Grace, her voice firm. "What happened to you is abuse, not love, not protection, not care, but control, erasing and breaking you." Grace sobbed, clutching her head. I think I've been brainwashed," she whispered. "Every thought in my head is his. I don't even know who I am anymore." Evelyn nodded, unsurprised. "That's something many survivors face, but you're doing the most important thing. You stepped out of that environment, and every passing minute, you are coming back to yourself, piece by piece." Grace rested her head on my shoulder, her eyes heavy. I stroked her hair, feeling her body slowly relax, for the first time since we'd found her. Within minutes, she drifted off to sleep, her breathing still shaky, but no longer terrified by every rustle outside. I looked at her thin, exhausted face, and a deep pain filled my chest, but there was also a tiny flicker, a flicker of hope. Because for the first time after years inside that dark box of control, Grace had stepped 1 foot out of it, and I would do anything to help her step out with the other. The second night at Troy's ranch carried an eerie stillness, a stillness that wasn't peaceful at all. It felt like a lake before a storm, unmoving, cold, and ready to shatter at the slightest tremor. Grace had fallen asleep early, drained after the emotional unraveling with Evelyn. But I, despite the burning in my eyes, couldn't close mine. I sat on the porch, staring at the darkness spreading across the hills, my heart tightening with the sense that things would get worse before they got better. And I was right. Near midnight, Troy received a message from someone in his old department, a guard from the gated community who saw Landon every day. He went to her cousin's house, yelled at the neighbors, showed photos. Troy, read it, then turned to me, his face darkening like the night swallowing the moonlight. I'm so sorry, Caroline. But he's reached Santa Fe. It felt like someone squeezed my chest with both hands. Is my sister okay? Yes, he didn't touch anyone, but he shouted, questioned neighbors, claimed you kidnapped an adult, that Grace is mentally unstable, showed them pictures of you both. And according to the guard, he looked completely unhinged. I closed my eyes, feeling myself sink into a cold abyss. Grace heard my shaky breath and sat up abruptly, still half asleep. Mom. What happened? Troy didn't hide it. He crouched down so she could see his face. Landon made it to Santa Fe, but everyone is safe. He's just hunting for clues. Grace clutched the blanket, her breathing fractured. He won't stop. Mom, I know him. He'll come here. Evelyn pulled her close, rubbing her back. We're prepared. Tomorrow, when the FBI office opens, we'll file everything. After that, he can't touch you. Tomorrow, Grace whispered, but there was no faith in her voice. That's tomorrow, but what about tonight? Tonight. Tonight was the word that silenced the whole room. Because tonight, no one knew where Landon was. No one knew how close he might be. No one knew if he had already found a trail. Troy stood, locking every door, pulling curtains tight, checking each window. He placed a heavy flashlight near the bed and took down his father's old hunting rifle from the wall. Just in case, he said, voice low, I pray we won't need it. The house grew thick with tension, a tension so sharp it felt like one wrong breath could break it. When Evelyn tucked Grace back into bed, I sat beside her, holding her hand as she drifted into uneasy sleep, jerking awake at the smallest noise. I held her hand as if letting go would make her disappear. Around 3 a.m, the hour humans are weakest, the hour fear becomes most real, I heard the first sound, a tiny one. But not the wind, not the wooden frame settling. It was the soft, unmistakable tap of someone touching glass. I shot upright, heart slamming into my ribs. I thought I imagined it, but then, crack! Glass shattered from the living room. I leapt to my feet. Grace, stay here, I shouted, running through the hallway. But Troy was already ahead of me, rifle in hand. Stay behind me, he barked. I ran anyway. I couldn't think of anything but Grace. Troy flipped on the living room light, and I saw him, Landon. He stood in the center of the room, his face twisted beyond recognition, his eyes bloodshot like someone who hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, dirt smeared on his sleeves. He must have pushed through bushes or fences to break in. His expression wasn't human anymore. It was obsession, ownership, madness. When he saw me, only me, his eyes ignited. Caroline, he growled, give me back my wife, or all of you will pay. Troy raised the gun. Don't move, one more step and I shoot. Landon laughed, a sound so cold it chilled my spine. You think you scare me? I didn't come alone. And at that moment, headlights blasted through the windows, harsh, blinding white. At least 2 cars. Figures stood behind the lights, silhouettes impossible to identify. Landon's eyes gleamed with mania. "She belongs to me. I'm taking her, and none of you can stop me." I tried to run to the bedroom, but before I could, "No, Mom." Grace stood in the hallway. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't hide behind me. She simply stood there, trembling but upright, facing the man who had shattered her spirit. Landon froze. "Grace, sweetheart." His voice flipped instantly from deranged to sugary poison. "They lied to you. You don't understand. Just come back and we'll fix everything. You just need to sign a few things. I'm doing all of this for you." Grace inhaled deeply. Her voice shook, but it was clear. "No, I'm not going with you." The air in the house detonated. Landon roared, "You're mine! You promised you'd always stay with me. You—" Evelyn stepped forward, calm as ice. "She's not your property." Troy tightened his grip on the trigger. Harold shielded Grace with his body, and I could only stare at my daughter, trembling but standing tall, facing the man who once held her mind in his hands. "Grace," Landon snarled, "you don't understand how dangerous this is. You only have to listen to me." "No," Grace said again, louder. "You're not someone who loves me. You're someone who wants to own me." I saw her knees weaken slightly, but she didn't fall. Grace was fighting the thing that had controlled her every day, and she was winning, even if just barely. Landon screamed, his voice slicing through the room. "If you don't come with me, then no one in this house is leaving alive." Troy immediately stepped forward. "Try it." Outside, the car lights shifted, and the shadows of the figures moved with them. Landon looked toward the window, then back at us, like a cornered animal. And I knew. This confrontation was only the beginning. One wrong move, and there would be blood. I held Grace's hand from behind, gripping it tightly, as if trying to give her strength I wasn't even sure I still had. The standoff among the three of us, me, my daughter, and the man who once controlled her life, had gone past the point of return. And I understood that tonight could determine the fate of my entire family. I had never known a moment that could feel both endless and as brief as a single breath, until the police burst into the ranch house in the middle of our confrontation with Landon. Everything happened too fast. Flashlight beams cutting through the windows, heavy footsteps on the ground, and shouts of "Police! Open up!" echoing through the cramped space. Troy didn't even have time to speak before the door flew open. 3 fully equipped officers stepped inside, one holding a flashlight, another raising a hand in a controlling gesture. They swept the light across the living room and stopped when they saw Landon standing close to Grace and me. "Hands down and step back," one officer shouted. But Landon, instead of fear, his face changed instantly. His voice turned soft as silk, dripping with the kind of deceit I had known all too well. "Thank God you're here." He pointed straight at me. "She kidnapped my wife. Grace is in an unstable mental state. I'm afraid she might harm herself." My heart clenched, as if someone had crushed it with their fist. All week I had prepared myself for countless possibilities, but not this. Landon had made the move before we did. He called the police, and he had already scripted the entire story. An officer turned to me. "Are you Caroline Mercer?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady even though my legs were shaking. "We received a report that you forcibly detained an adult against her will and caused her emotional distress." I opened my mouth to explain, but Landon immediately cut in, as if he had memorized his lines. "She's been manipulating her daughter, filling her head with lies that I'm hurting her. I have medical records proving Grace has had episodes of instability. I'm only here to take her home. I felt frozen. Harold stepped forward but was blocked by an officer. Evelyn squeezed my hand gently, reminding me not to react emotionally. But in that moment, Landon's wall of lies seemed as tall as a mountain, while my truth felt like a petal caught in the wind. An officer turned to Grace. "Ms. Grace, do you want to leave with your husband?" Grace didn't move. Just hours ago, she had trembled at the sound of his name. Now that question pierced right into her deepest fear. Landon took one step, pretending to care about her. "Come on, sweetheart, come home with me. Everything will be okay." Grace stepped back, only slightly, but enough to make Landon stiffen. "Ms. Grace," the officer repeated, "are you being held here against your will?" The air thickened. I felt the whole room tilt. If Grace didn't speak, the police would believe Landon. He had a story, fake documents, and that polished, gentle exterior he had cultivated for years. My knees almost buckled when I saw Grace lower her head, her shoulders shaking. "Grace," I whispered softly, not begging, not pushing, just calling my daughter the way I did when she was little, when she needed to know her mother was still there. Grace lifted her head. Her eyes were swollen and red, but no longer empty. Something inside her had shifted. A small, bright piece of courage strong enough to push back against the darkness that had swallowed her for 2 years. And in a voice weak but clear, Grace said, "I want to file a report." No one moved for several seconds. Even the officers were stunned. Landon let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Grace, you're being coerced." Grace raised her hand, stopping him. "I am not kidnapped. I left because I was threatened. I want to file a report for abuse." An officer stepped closer. "Do you have any evidence?" Grace looked at me. I nodded. "Go ahead, sweetheart. The truth has been waiting to be spoken." Grace opened the cloth bag Rosa had given her. Her hands still trembled, but she placed each item on the table, like she was laying down the foundation of her freedom. This is the audio recording, where he talks about creating an accident for my mother. These are photos of property documents with forged signatures of me and my mom. This is a message I never sent, but has my name on it. The officers leaned in. Their expressions shifted from suspicion to confusion to realization. Harold added gently, "All of these are time-stamped properly. We'll provide full originals first thing in the morning." Grace still wasn't done. She pulled up her sleeve. Bruises, the deep purple marks Landon had left, were exposed under the light. One officer murmured, "My God." Those bruises, they needed no explanation. They spoke every truth Grace had been forced to swallow. Landon's expression twisted. He stepped back, his mouth opening as if scrambling for excuses. She did that herself. But no one believed him anymore. An officer looked at him, cold as steel. "Landon Whitmore, you're coming with us for questioning." Landon snapped. He lunged at Grace. "You belong to me. You can't." Troy rushed forward, but the officers were faster. They pinned Landon to the floor, twisting his arms behind him as he screamed, "Grace, you'll pay for this. All of you will." The click of the handcuffs echoed sharply, a cold, final sound, enough to make Grace burst into tears. The police led him out. The flashing lights from the patrol car cut across the wooden walls, glinting off the tears on Grace's face like broken moonlight. When the door shut, when the engines faded, when silence returned, Grace collapsed in front of me. I I thought I was going to die in that house, she whispered, each word rising from years of swallowed fear. Mom, if you hadn't come, I don't think I'd still be alive. I pulled her into my arms, holding her as tightly as I could, wishing I could mend every wound she had endured in the darkness. No, sweetheart, I said, my voice breaking. You survived. You did. You're stronger than you think. Evelyn stepped beside us and placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. This is the first step, and it's the hardest one. Grace held my hand, and for the first time, it didn't tremble. In that moment, I knew that my daughter, the girl I thought I had lost to control, fear, and lies, was finding her way back. Not because of a miracle, but because she had reclaimed something that had been stolen from her. Her voice. I once believed that the moment the police handcuffed Landon and took him out of the ranch would be the end of that nightmare. But as Harold had warned earlier, justice doesn't come overnight, Caroline. Especially when the enemy is someone who knows how to hide his crimes and manipulate emotions. And he was right. Just 3 days after the break-in, Landon's lawyer filed for bail. I wanted to object, to scream that he would continue threatening us. But the legal system doesn't run on emotions. It runs on procedure. He was granted bail with conditions, a substantial bond and a restraining order. Grace panicked when she heard. He'll find me, she whispered, trembling, and I held her close, listening to her heartbeat pounding in terror. Troy reassured her. He made a critical mistake breaking in. Our case is solid. The moment he violates the restraining order, he's back in jail. But fear doesn't disappear because someone says so. It needs time. And Grace needed more time than anyone could imagine. In the following days, we left the ranch. Not by choice, but out of necessity. We chose Portland, far enough, quiet enough, and full of support services for survivors of domestic abuse. When the car passed the Welcome to Portland sign, I glanced at Grace. She sat by the window, her eyes still darkened with exhaustion, but her face looked less tense, as if she had walked out of a long tunnel, and this was the first light she had seen in years. Evelyn moved to Portland a few weeks later to continue therapy. I knew that wasn't something every doctor would do, and I was deeply grateful. The first session took place in our small living room, sunlight pouring onto Grace's face, highlighting the faint bruises still lingering. "How are you feeling today?" Evelyn asked softly. Grace smiled, a small, fragile smile. "I don't know. Some days, I think I'm okay. But then I hear footsteps in the hallway and I can't breathe." Evelyn nodded. "That's trauma. Very common. You lived in fear too long. Your brain needs time to understand you're safe." Grace stared at her hands. "I feel guilty for trusting the wrong person, for leaving Mom, for not seeing the truth." I wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her nothing was her fault, but Evelyn held my gaze. This was something Grace needed to walk through herself. "Grace," Evelyn said, "victims of coercive control never know they're victims while they're in it. You weren't weak. You were isolated, made to doubt yourself. No one is strong enough to resist that alone." Grace lifted her eyes, tears falling freely for the first time without wiping them away. "I want to believe that." I held her hand. "You're not weak, Grace. You're a survivor." She broke into tears, not the terrified kind, but the relieved kind. While Grace healed, Harold kept digging. When he laid a thick stack of papers in front of me, my breath caught. Caroline, this wasn't just about Grace. The file was packed with evidence of Landon's involvement in shady transfers, forged property documents, and hidden debts. Grace wasn't targeted because she was naive. She was targeted because she had legal value he wanted to exploit. "So that means," I whispered. "It means," Harold said gravely, "Grace wasn't foolish. She was systematically groomed." After he left, I stared out at Portland's gray sky. Light rain began to fall, and for the first time in months, I felt something lift off my chest. Grace hadn't failed. She had survived something designed to break her completely. In the weeks that followed, I saw her change, piece by piece. The first time she laughed at a cat video. The first time she went grocery shopping without checking behind her. The first time she finished a plate of pasta without worrying he would call her fat. The first time she slept 7 hours. Real sleep, not jolting awake from nightmares. And the first time she looked at me and smiled softly, "Mom, I think I'm going to be okay." I turned away so she wouldn't see my tears. I had once believed I'd lost her forever, swallowed by manipulation and fear. But truth remained where lies had tried to bury it. Maternal love doesn't disappear because someone hides it. It only gets covered, and slowly we brush the dust away. But while we healed, Landon kept making mistakes. He sent anonymous messages to Grace, called from unknown numbers, watched her from outside a therapy office. Even with the restraining order, he kept violating it. And that sent him back to jail. When the police informed us, Grace exhaled like she had dropped a stone she'd carried for years. I held her, whispering, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." But she and I knew fear doesn't evaporate instantly. It melts slowly, like ice under spring sun, and someday it would be only a memory. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset turn the Willamette River red, Grace whispered, "Mom, if you hadn't come for me, I don't think I'd still be alive to see this sky." I squeezed her hand. "You saved yourself when you said no. I only walked beside you." She rested her head on my shoulder. "Mom, am I ready for the trial?" The wind brushed past us, carrying the scent of the river and the quiet of evening. I looked at the daughter who had once been shattered and was now slowly standing tall again, and I knew the final battle still awaited us. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "We're ready." We didn't know how long the trial would last. We didn't know what Landon would try next. We didn't know where this would take our family. But we knew one thing. This would be the biggest battle, and the last one. On the first morning of the trial, Portland was wrapped in a thin layer of fog. The sky was gray without a hint of sunlight, but somehow it felt fitting for the moment we were about to face. The moment that would end years of manipulation, threats, and fear. Grace held my hand as we climbed the steps of the federal courthouse. Her hand still trembled, but it was no longer the desperate trembling from before. It was the trembling of someone about to walk into her final confrontation. One fought in public, before dozens of eyes, before the law, and before the man who once held her captive through invisible chains. Troy and Evelyn walked behind us. Harold waited at the entrance, holding the black case that contained all the evidence against Landon. "If justice had a face today," Harold said as he opened the door, "I believe it would be named Grace Mercer." Grace swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and nodded. The courtroom was large but suffocating. On the left sat our side, me, Grace, Harold, and our support team. On the right was Landon and his attorney. I looked at him. Landon appeared in his familiar gray suit, his tie straightened, his hair neatly slicked back. If someone didn't know the truth, anyone could believe he was a successful man here to resolve a small financial dispute. But I knew better than anyone that neatness was only a facade. He sat down at the defendant's table, looking around the courtroom as if this were his stage. And then, when his eyes landed on Grace, he gave a small smile. A smile that was arrogant, taunting, and chilling. Grace stiffened. I squeezed her hand tightly. "Don't look at him. Look at me." Grace turned to me, and in her eyes I saw both fear and determination. The hearing began. The judge, a silver-haired woman whose face suggested she had witnessed many family tragedies, asked each side to present their case. Landon's attorney stood first. His voice was smooth, practiced, and clearly rehearsed many times. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of a long misunderstanding. His wife, Ms. Grace, has shown signs of mental instability over the past year. Her mother, Mrs. Carolyn, removed her from the home against her will, causing her to panic. Several bruises thought to be from abuse were actually self-inflicted due to emotional dysregulation." Grace bowed her head. I saw her shoulders tremble. But Evelyn gently touched her back. "Breathe, Grace. You only need to inhale and exhale." When Harold rose, his voice was calm but razor sharp. "Your Honor, we will begin with the financial evidence." He took out 3 thick folders, each marked with colored tabs. "This is proof that Landon Whitmore forged transfer documents for 3 properties owned by Grace and her mother, with the intent to seize their assets. All signatures have been inspected and confirmed as fraudulent." He held up each page. The signatures were stretched unnaturally. The handwriting of Grace leaned too far to the right, clearly forged, but sophisticated enough to fool most people. Next, Harold played the audio recording, the one Rosa captured while eavesdropping behind the door as Landon talked about a fall-down-the-stairs accident meant for me. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's brows knitted. Landon's attorney tried to interject. "That could have been a joke." "Try joking about getting rid of your mother-in-law in front of a judge," Harold replied, his voice so cold that the courtroom paused for several seconds. Then it was Grace's turn. Grace stood. I heard the soft scrape of the chair, a tiny sound, but loud enough to make me want to hold her all over again. She walked to the witness stand, each step heavy as if carrying a year's worth of fear with her. When she reached the stand, I could see her hands gripping the sides of the chair. "Miss Grace," the judge asked, "are you ready to testify?" Grace nodded. "Yes, I am." The first sentence wavered, but as she continued, her voice grew clearer, steadier. "Landon is not the person he presents here. I lived with him for over 2 years, and in those 2 years, I went through cycles most people never see. It started with sweetness, with care. Then it turned into control." The whole room went silent. No whisper, no shifting of chairs. Grace swallowed hard and continued. "He controlled what I ate, what I wore. He told me I was fat, made me diet until some nights I could barely stand. He took my phone every night, read every message, deleted my friends, forbade me from seeing my mother." Her voice caught. I placed a hand over my heart to keep it from exploding. "Then came the punishments," Grace said, softer now. "He never hit me where anyone could see, only in hidden places. He threatened me if I ever left the house. Then he apologized, brought gifts, and the cycle repeated again." Tears rolled down her cheeks. But this time, she didn't wipe them away. Grace lifted her sleeve. The faint but undeniable bruises appeared under the courtroom lights. A sharp gasp came from someone behind us. Landon's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection! Those bruises!" "Sit down," the judge said, her voice sharp as a blade. "She is testifying." Grace forced herself to steady her voice. "I thought the apologies would change things. I thought He loved me, but he only wanted to control me, seize my assets, eliminate my mother. I lived like someone who had no breath left. She looked at the judge, her voice suddenly strong enough to silence the room again. The day I ran, if my mother hadn't come for me, I don't think I would be alive to stand here today. That was the moment I lowered my head into my hands and let the tears fall. But I didn't sob, didn't tremble. They were not tears of pain anymore, but tears of someone who had just watched her child return from the edge of a cliff. The judge took a few notes. "Thank you, Miss Grace." Grace walked back to us. I stood, wrapped her in my arms, and felt her heartbeat against my chest. No longer the heartbeat of fear, but of someone who had reclaimed the right to live. When it was time for the verdict, no one in the courtroom held a shred of doubt. The judge read each charge clearly. Landon Whitmore is found guilty of large-scale financial fraud, forgery of legal documents, emotional domestic abuse, issuing threats to life, and violating a restraining order. I looked at him. The arrogance on his face had collapsed into a fear I had never seen in him before. Sentence: 17 years in federal prison with no eligibility for reduction during the first 8 years. His attorney rushed to say something, but Landon stood frozen, his face pale. I didn't look at him again. I looked at Grace. She walked out of the courtroom, her breathing unsteady but her eyes shining with something I hadn't seen in years: life. On the courthouse steps, the city wind blew through her hair. Grace lifted her face to the sky, tears rolling but her lips curved into a smile. "Mom," she whispered softly, "I feel like I was born again." I held my daughter tightly, pressing my face into the hair that had once been drenched in tears, but now smelled of freedom. "Not born again, Grace," I whispered. "You were born for real, this time into freedom, into light, into the truth you fought so bravely to reclaim." And in that moment, I knew our story had reached the end of its darkness, and the doorway to a new life had opened wide for both of us. 5 years have passed since the day the trial ended, since the day Grace walked out of those courthouse doors with tears streaming down her face, but with a heart that, for the first time, understood what freedom felt like. 5 years, not long in a lifetime, yet long enough to heal wounds I once feared would stay with her forever. Now every morning I wake up in our little house in North Seattle, open the window to breathe in the crisp air carrying the scent of young pine, and each time I do, I silently thank life for giving us another chance. Grace is the one who has changed the most. Now 34, she works at a support center for domestic abuse survivors. She didn't choose this job out of ambition, but out of gratitude. Grace once told me, "I don't want anyone to spend years realizing they deserve a different life." I watch her when she stands before groups of women who arrive with dark circles under their eyes, slumped shoulders, exhausted gazes. Grace doesn't lecture or preach. She simply tells her story, softly, like she's speaking to a friend, and that sincerity has saved countless lives. My own life changed in ways I never expected. After the trial, I opened a small bookstore on a quiet street near Green Lake. It isn't large, just 2 rooms with old wooden shelves and soft armchairs. But somehow it seems to hold an entire world. Sometimes I host gatherings about domestic abuse, inviting women who have lived stories like ours to sit together, drink tea, and speak of things they never dared to say out loud before. I'm not an expert or a therapist. I'm just a mother who once lost her daughter to darkness and was lucky enough to find her before it was too late. the bookstore gradually became a refuge for wounded souls. Some come just to listen. Some stay to rediscover themselves. Some silently place a book on the counter and cry. And all of them remind me of this simple truth. Surviving isn't just continuing to breathe. It's reclaiming your life after the storm has passed. Rosa lives near us as well. She, the woman who risked everything to warn me that night, has become an irreplaceable part of our family. We often joke that life stitched us into a chosen family, and sometimes the family you choose becomes stronger than the one you're born into. Every weekend we cook together. Rosa always brings her cornbread that she proudly claims is better than the Mexican place down the street. Grace brings a vegetable salad Evelyn taught her to help rebuild healthy eating habits. And I make chicken soup, the dish Grace used to crave but never dared cook in the years she lived with Landon because the smell bothered him. Now we cook it every week as a small symbol of freedom. But healing isn't a straight path. There are nights when Grace jolts awake, sweat soaking her back, her eyes wide as if she were seeing him standing in that ranch house again. But instead of shrinking in fear, Grace calls my name. "Mom, where am I?" And I go to her, kneel by the bed, hold her hand, and say, "You're home. There's no one here." The nightmares have grown fewer with time. The panic spells shorter, and small things like laughing at a movie, slowing down to watch the sunset, or stepping into a clothing store without fearing judgment are quiet victories we celebrate in our own way. We built a new home, not out of wood and brick, but out of peace, respect, and love untouched by fear. A home with no stalking footsteps, no controlling gaze, no threats, just 3 women, my daughter, Rosa, and me, walking out of the past and into a future on steadier legs. One evening on the balcony, watching the sun melt into the horizon, Grace rested her head on my shoulder. The orange glow on her face made her look like a completely new version of herself. Not the old Grace, not the shattered Grace, but the Grace of today, strong, grounded, and free. "Mom," she whispered, "the moment I escaped him, that was the moment I returned to you. I thought I lost you, but really, I lost myself." I held her hand, feeling like I was touching a life she had stitched back together with her own courage. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You never lost me. You were just wandering through a place that was too dark. I only did what mothers do. I went to find you." The sky that day glowed a breathtaking shade of gold. I knew our story had reached its end, not in sorrow, but in hope. The deepest wounds had finally begun to heal. I know I lost many things. The years Grace spent under manipulation, the empty nights without messages, the days wondering whether my daughter was alive in spirit or completely broken. But I also found everything again, my daughter, my family, and myself. And if there is one thing I want to offer anyone listening to our story, it's this. A mother will fight to her very last breath to pull her child out of the abyss. Not out of obligation, not out of duty, but because love never gives up. Thank you. Yes, you, for staying with me until the end of this story. Where are you watching from in America or anywhere in the world? I would love to hear your voice, feel your heart, and know whether our journey touched a corner of your own life. If you felt a pain like ours, please remember, you are not alone. You deserve peace. You deserve a love that does not hurt you. Share with me in the comments. Every story you tell could become a lifeline for someone still sinking in silence. And if you want to walk with me through more stories of healing, please subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a like. not just to support us, but to let me know there are hearts out there walking beside me as we keep lighting the way forward. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for your patience, your empathy, and for becoming part of the light that helped my daughter and me step out of the darkness. I hope to see you again on the next journey.